Good afternoon and welcome to the February 26, 2018 informational hearing on best practices for reporting sexual harassment and providing victim support. I want to welcome you all today. We have a very informative panel that's going to be talking with us to continue our series in exploring the issues surrounding sexual harassment here in the Capitol and how we can change our policies to make them more protective of our employees. And with that, I'm going to go to Senator Mitchell and to the rest of the panel for the commission for opening comments.
Chair, thank you for the opportunity, and it's been a pleasure working in this bicameral format, and thank you for the opportunity for letting the Senate take the lead in shaping today's hearing. We are working out a system in which the two houses kind of share in that responsibility. I just very briefly wanted to kind of remind us all of the approach that we're taking, Madam Chair, in this hearing process. Our first two hearings focused on reviewing best practices for changing culture on sexual harassment, defining harassment and identifying challenges, and of course today's hearing, which is going to focus on reporting and providing victim support. At our last hearing, you may recall I raised a question about how we manage and handle the anonymous complaint, and really trying to figure out, as it's clear to me that the charge of this committee is to be able to provide to the Joint Rules Committee a recommendation on a new way of doing business in the state capitol, a new way of doing business that both houses will buy into. So whether you're an employee and you work in the Senate or the Assembly, you will know about the new bicameral process by which these issues will be handled. And so I'm hoping today's witnesses, today's group of experts around the reporting issue can touch bases, can touch on the issue around anonymous complaints. If indeed that's the best way to increase the likelihood that people are comfortable, or if there's another way we can really get at this issue. I'm looking forward to hearing the various ways in which technology is now being used to support reporting, and just want to join you in thanking all the witnesses who will be joining us today. I look forward to continuing to learn and broaden my own skill set and horizons in terms of how we receive information and figure out a way in which we can build a system that works for both houses of our legislature. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any of the other members want to speak? Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to thank Senator Mitchell for a little private conversation we had on what we're trying to accomplish. And so right now it's a good listening time. Madam Chair, last week in the Senate we had a rather unique historical event. And so I started going through some of the literature that we've been given at our own training in the Senate, and trying to read through it again and again, and also listening to some of the criticisms, like the LA Times saying, you know, there's really not clarity, and that became my conclusion. If we were to have spoken on the floor, it's very vague. So as we listen, I'm wondering, Madam Chair, if we just, maybe we start building one of those dashboards that said, this is a good idea, we need to implement, we ought to include this in the mix when we develop policies. Or maybe if I could have permission at times to say, hey, have you read our policy, and what would you change as we build towards something that will be very helpful to all? And those are my observations, so thank you.
Thank you. That's really great input, and we have been absolutely taking notes whenever one of the committee members mentions an idea that they'd like to bring back for discussion or make sure is incorporated as we move our policies forward. And I encourage all of you to feel free to do that, and certainly to ask questions of all the panelists. They're here to be resources, and to you know, I know that a lot of them have been watching what's been happening here and definitely have opinions about the way we do things and the way that, you know, they would recommend for certain changes to be made. So, you know, this is our time with them to really get the most that we can out of their knowledge and their experience. Ms. Waldron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just really briefly, being able to hear about best practices for reporting sexual harassment is very critical, and you know, it's good that we're at this point in our hearings. one of the big things is the confusion involved with, an incident happens and, there's a lot. It's not black and white. There's so many layers. Is this something I should talk about? Is it worth bringing forward? You don't feel good about it. And I call it the 3 R's: the respect for the victim and what they've gone through, resources, having resources available, and then resolution, which is getting to, the end of it, getting a resolution for the victim.
Thank you. Anybody else for now? Terrific. One thing that I will also mention as an issue that maybe one of the panelists wants to talk about is whether, whatever the penalties that are to any of these issues, ever prevents a witness from coming forward. Whether that personally affects a victim because of maybe the person's an employer, or whether they're worried, they want a certain type of response and are afraid that they're not going to get it. So that would be just something that I would throw out as maybe something for some of the panelists to discuss. And with that, I'm going to call up our first panelist. I will let them introduce themselves when they come up. The first panel is on best practices and challenges to reporting sexual harassment. Nushin Nathan, the Chief Talent Officer and Chief Human Resources Officer for the Museum of Natural History in Los Angeles County, and Ashley Klein Jimenez, Project Manager for California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And as always, we'll hold our questions until the end of the panelists' presentations. And with that, I will invite our panel to speak. Ms. Nathan, if you would like to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairwoman Friedman, Chairwoman Mitchell, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm Nushin Nathan, Chief Talent Officer of the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History. I appear before you today on behalf of Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, the world's largest HR professional society, representing 290,000 members, including 25,000 in California. SHRM members in turn influence the lives of over 100 million individuals in the workforce, about 1 in 3 Americans. It was not until the 1990s that sexual harassment in the workplace rose to social consciousness. In 1993, in the case of Harris versus Forklift Systems, Inc., the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that sexual harassment was not limited to acts that result in physical or severe psychological injury, thereby including pervasive sexist remarks, innuendo, and advances under the definition of abusive or hostile environment. At the other end of the decade, in 1998, with Burlington Industries versus Ellerth and Farragher versus City of Boca Raton, the Supreme Court ruled that employers are liable for sexual harassment even where no professionally adverse action against the claimant occurred. However, the employer may defend itself by showing it took measures to prevent or immediately correct any such instances. The need for employer to protect its employees and defend itself sowed the seed for human resources implementing procedures on sexual harassment prevention and response. These great changes in our laws, in our history and culture, were brought about by many brave people, particularly women, who were not afraid to voice their experiences until they were heard. But sexual harassment is not limited to women. It happens to men and those whose gender identity falls anywhere on the spectrum. It can happen to any of us. Common workplace-based responses by those who experience sex-based harassment are to avoid the harasser, deny or downplay the gravity of the situation, or attempt to ignore, forget, or endure the behavior. They fear disbelief of their claim, inaction on their claim, blame, or social or professional retaliation. As SHRM's CEO and President Johnny C. Taylor noted in January before this committee, culture trumps policy, and workplaces must create a holistic culture of non-harassment that starts at the top. Part of having a positive and productive workplace is ensuring that when someone feels they have been a victim of workplace harassment or has witnessed harassment or behavior that violates the culture of the organization, the employer has a process to address these issues. Sexual harassment is best prevented and confronted when the channels of communication are safe, swift, and unencumbered. Therefore, the first and most critical step for changing culture on sexual harassment is providing an accessible reporting process for those confronting harassment in the workplace. The Natural History Museum, NHM, of Los Angeles County prides itself on its collegial environment. We encourage our employees to share their concerns about workplace issues with colleagues, regardless of standing. If such concerns require guidance or are grave in nature, such as workplace harassment, our supervisors, managers, and directors have been trained to bring the information to human resources in a discreet and timely manner. In addition to encouraging an open door policy, we have recently launched a program called Speak Up NHM. NHM stands for Natural History Museum. We implemented this program last year as a way of commitment to our value of inclusivity and allowing multiple channels of hearing and listening to the concerns of our stakeholders. This 24/7 program is operated by a third-party organization, allowing our employees to report any workplace issues with the option of confidentiality and anonymity. Once a claim has been made over the phone or through email, the caller will receive a case number and instructions for follow-up. The matter will then be forwarded to me for review, investigation, and action. The response will contain specifics on what action has been taken or will be taken to address the concern. We have even taken measures to allow for an employee to file a complaint about anyone in the HR department, which our third-party organization will forward to our general counsel for review. This program and others like it are a means for employees to report without shame or fear of retaliation, and with the option of confidentiality. There's no need to report the issue to your supervisor or even your supervisor's supervisor if the employee doesn't want to. Providing a service like this signals to employees that their concerns matter and will be taken seriously. It exemplifies our continuous efforts to hear the voices of our stakeholders by any means possible. It also helps lay a foundation of trust and builds a culture that is constantly looking for opportunities to create a safe and collaborative work environment that is free from harassment. Through whatever means a claim has been reported, that claim must be handled through consistent procedures. Having procedures in place ensures that the claim would flow through a predictable cycle. In general, that cycle should include the claim, the investigation, the findings, and corrective action. Throughout the process, all relevant information must be properly documented. Documentation serves two functions. It assists in the determination of corrective action to be taken and is evidence that action has been taken. Sexual harassment of any kind is always serious and should accordingly be treated as such, regardless of the hierarchy within the organization. It should not matter to whom the claim was made. Once it has been reported, the processor of the information must take it to those who will perform an unbiased investigation. That investigation must be comprehensive in nature and yet limited in the number of individuals involved. Too many participants may not only contaminate the investigation's objectivity, but may negatively affect the employee's trust and day-to-day experience among his or her peers. Yet it is not enough to respond. It is our responsibility to prevent. Prevention requires education and training of our employees and managers. However, even effective training cannot occur in a vacuum. It must be part of a holistic culture of non-harassment that starts at the top. When the term sexual harassment is used, what comes to minds of many people are not the smaller but persistent and intolerable acts. It is the extreme acts, the acts we hear about on the news that come to mind. Roger Ailes, Bill Cosby, Bill O'Reilly, Harvey Weinstein, Yet harassment can take many forms, and employees need to understand that behavior that may be smaller in scope but still persistent and intolerable acts of harassment. We must therefore define what constitutes harassment from the beginning of an individual's employment. We must provide them with the tools necessary to identify what it is, why it is a problem, who to report it to, how it will be addressed, where they can find additional support, and when to expect closure. This is the key to ensuring that our access and procedures are properly utilized. Education must take the form of clear and public written policy, easy to locate and easy to reference. Education should be interactive. We cannot shy away from topics that make us uncomfortable. We must speak about it freely and empower all managers to help effectively with confidence and compassion. We must infuse civility within our work culture and empower our colleagues to speak up as bystanders witnessing unwelcome behaviors. Once a claim has been made, we are now on notice to act. The longer it takes to respond to a sexual harassment claim, the less faith an individual complainant has in HR's response. We cannot allow that faith to become brittle. We are accountable to live up to it. Nevertheless, we're human and imperfect. Weaknesses in policy and procedures may and will be discovered along the way. They should be corrected as they are discovered, and the policies and procedures audited regularly in between. Leadership must ask itself, is this protocol necessary? Is it efficient? How do we gauge our current education's effectiveness? Should we do a focus group? An anonymous survey? How can we best communicate to everyone any changes? It is not enough for employees to hold their leaders accountable. Leaders must hold themselves and their peers to the same standards. This requires universal commitment to maintaining a harassment-free workplace. Current law requires managers to be retrained in sexual harassment prevention training every 2 years. While this law is important, it cannot replace the role that leadership in the organization plays in creating and maintaining a policy that includes access, procedures, and education. Our senior leaders must lead by example, for they set the tone of any organization above and beyond the law with best practices. Leaders must serve as role models for a diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace by refusing to tolerate inappropriate behavior, by addressing it expediently when it occurs. In popular culture, human resources is often the running joke, the department to be feared or scorned as unnecessary taskmasters. HR departments need to consistently review, improve, and advocate for programs that create and foster a safe, productive work environment that is conducive to co-elevating our colleagues. It has often been said that the fall of Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood was a watershed moment, but we will have many more such moments as our children nurture the wisdom vested in them. We see it now in the Me Too and Never Again movements. These young people who remain unblushing by the contempt of social media or political provocateurs will bring us closer to restoring justice. It is for these reasons that I remain optimistic in my view that we can still bring changes as professionals, as imperfect but ambitious human beings, and that the future will indeed hold a more kind, self-aware, and just world. SHRM pledges to work with the committee as it addresses this important issue. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Klein Jimenez.
Good afternoon, Chair Friedman, Co-Chair Mitchell, and members of the committee. My name is Ashley Klein Jimenez, and I am a project manager with the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or as we're more commonly known, CalCASA. I'm also accompanied by my colleague, John Finley. CalCASA provides leadership, vision, and resources to 84 rape crisis centers in California and a variety of institutions across the nation committed to ending sexual violence in all its forms. Sexual harassment is a form of sexual violence that impacts survivors and victims beyond the incident. At CalCASA, we work to center the needs of survivors through a trauma-informed approach. This approach recognizes the impact of trauma on the survivor and actively resists re-traumatizing them. When it comes to reporting incidents of sexual harassment, survivors face numerous barriers, and many survivors delay reporting for various reasons. One of the reasons is associated with the complexity of sexual violence and the intimate nature of the incident. It is common for survivors to feel ashamed and embarrassed of what has happened, making it difficult to share with anyone. Additionally, individuals may not know their rights or the processes for filing a complaint and may experience normal reactions to trauma that can include ignoring or burying the sexual violence in order to survive and continue in their day-to-day activities. It is important that survivors are provided with confidential resources for support and that they are aware of the various remedies, processes, and resources available to them. Survivors may also choose not to report or delay reporting out of fear, specifically fear of the consequences. Survivors may fear losing their job and experiencing retaliation from their employer and coworkers, as well as the person who caused them harm. There is a fear in being labeled a troublemaker and the impacts that can have on someone's professional career. There is also fear that they will not be believed, or if they are believed, that it won't be taken seriously. Complaints about sexual harassment have historically been brushed off as jokes, or not a big deal, or just how things are. Survivors also hold numerous social identities, including race, nationality, socioeconomic status, gender identities, sexual orientation, and language. Historical and multi-generational oppression based on these identities intersect with sexual violence and can cause further barriers in reporting. Survivors may feel that the personal, social, and professional consequences of reporting sexual harassment are far too great, especially when they worry that the complaint will not be taken seriously. While the trauma associated with sexual harassment and the barriers to reporting are very real, there are steps that employers can take to address sexual harassment and start to shift the culture to create an environment where survivors are supported and where sexual harassment can be prevented. Strong policies send a clear message that organizations will support survivors and hold people accountable for the harm they have caused. We must also acknowledge that policies can be overridden when the underlying beliefs and values that have supported a culture of sexual harassment are not addressed. Employers should establish clear policies that are communicated effectively, applied consistently, and reviewed often, and promote a culture of respect where everyone is valued. This requires shifting away from norms that value claiming and maintaining power over others to norms that support equity. Leadership can model respect for people's boundaries, encourage bystanders to speak up, and make safety for all a shared responsibility. Ongoing training, which is something that CalCASA provides, should also be provided to leadership and supervisors on how to promote a positive, respectful, and safe climate for employees. All employees should be provided training on how to provide support and speak up when they witness harmful behaviors. Leaders can conduct confidential anonymous surveys to gather information on organizational conditions, identify areas that need improvement, and drive action to improve the climate experienced by employees. Employers can also be proactive by making sexual violence and harassment an ongoing conversation. Silence allows people to go unchecked, condones unacceptable behavior, and maintains the status quo. Talking openly and regularly about sexual harassment shifts the culture of silence that has allowed sexual violence to flourish. We only have to look to college campuses to see how a cultural shift around silence can encourage people to report sexual violence. Over the last several years, as college campuses have committed to better addressing, preventing, and responding to sexual violence, many have seen increases in reports of sexual violence. This doesn't necessarily mean that more sexual assaults have occurred, but rather that campuses have started to create climates where survivors are more comfortable coming forward and reporting their experiences. This is a good thing. We must also recognize the role gender equity plays in institutions and work to close those gaps. Environments where women are routinely isolated and intimidated are ripe for sexual violence. In closing, supporting survivors is crucial for promoting a culture of intolerance for sexual violence. We must pay attention to the varying experiences and needs of survivors. And we must also address the underlying social and cultural norms that have allowed sexual violence to run rampant in our institutions and communities and commit to changing them. Thank you so much for inviting me here today.
Thank you. We're going to move to questions now, and I just have one question, if you don't mind, just to start it off. So clearly there are challenges to encouraging people to come forward either with sexual violence or sexual harassment. In the assembly, supervisors are given an extra 20 minutes of training. But it seems to me that in 20 minutes, maybe all you can do is tell them how to report. And by the way, we don't require people to report to the supervisors. They can actually report directly to Human Resources. They can report to a number of individuals. But it seems that given the challenges of helping people face those challenges, that there's a lot of additional responsibility on mandatory reporters and supervisors to know how to take those reports and to make everyone that they come in contact with understand that there is a way to report, that you know, and to be more encouraging of reporting when there are issues in the workplace. So what does comprehensive training look like for those individuals? Is there any best standard out there specifically for mandatory reporters and supervisors? I don't know whether it's the same type of training maybe that's given to the people on Weave who are on the other end of the telephone, or whether it's something a little different. But do you have any ideas of what we can look to beef up what's clearly at this point an inadequate amount of training that's given to that sort of front line of individuals?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Friedman. So I would say that because at Cal CASA we are really focused on providing a trauma-informed approach. I find that to be a very significant place to start, is having people understand that when someone comes forward to report a sexual assault, there is a lot of trauma that is also coming with that. And we are not necessarily just born knowing how to deal with people and their trauma. And so training around what trauma looks like, how trauma impacts people, can't be done in 20 minutes and is absolutely important if we want people to feel comfortable coming towards us. How people respond to a survivor when they have disclosed sexual harassment can have a real impact on whether they continue forward in the reporting process, whether they get counseling, really what they do next to deal with their trauma and heal from that. So I think that's very important. I also think that having people understand the resources that are available to survivors, giving people options, giving survivors options is really important. And if people can be a wealth of information and let them know what resources are available and what options are available is really important as well.
Terrific. Thank you. Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, ma'am. Staying on the issue of training and culture change and the role of training within it, which I've been reading a lot about. Lots of mixed feelings about the role of training, because it's not about lack of education, it's behavior change. Right. So I wonder if from your perspective and experience, if it's appropriate to kind of start before the beginning, as in, again, to affect culture change, if it's important to check implicit bias, to test implicit bias, just so as you're going through the training, everyone has to be conscious of and clear about their current perceptions around gender bias before we begin to then correct their behavior. Any comments you may have on that, either of you?
Yeah, we're actually right now we're actually going to bring implicit bias training to our museum and all staff. Now, that doesn't just address sexual harassment. It addresses inclusivity, race, equity, sense of belonging, bringing your whole self to work. So absolutely, especially because we serve 1.3 million people in public, we want to make sure that even when our visitors are coming to the museum, we're not bringing our biases, our implicit biases forward and not welcoming certain groups. So I think that would be actually very vital to have continuous implicit bias and to change those and to challenge those general ideas that people have of roles of different people in different sexes, races, also all of that.
And I would just add that it really takes unpacking so much of what we have all grown up in as a society. And so there is a lot of thinking about issues, broader issues of oppression and roles that we've all played. And I agree that it's not the education that's the issue. It's how we interact. So it's the systems that we put into place and the environments that we create.
All of my colleagues and I would agree that we don't want to just build a system to report and create safe reporting after the fact. We have a goal around prevention as well. So that's why I'm asking the question in terms of culture shift and the role training plays in that. Two more questions, Madam Chair, if I may. To Ms. Nathan. How many employees at Natural History Museum?
We have about 450 employees and 700 volunteers.
And do volunteers go? So are volunteers incorporated into?
They do go through training
and reporting, so that all that. So your structure impacts both volunteers and employees.
They do go through training.
You mentioned it was important to limit the number of participants. Was the word you used in investigations, and I assume you meant the number of people conducting the investigation.
Correct.
Okay, I wanted to make sure I was clear about that. And how, in both of your experience, have you all managed anonymous reporting?
I have. This new system that we have, Speak Up NHM, ever since we instituted, we have had about 7 anonymous complaints, and they've been very soft touch issues that have been brought to us, like a manager's behavior, let's say talking about someone's weight, which was inappropriate. So it hasn't been anything that's been heavy duty, but still we look into it, we address it, we respond, and that individual that has anonymously reported will receive a response from us.
And this is probably an unfair question, and I'm going to say that and then ask it anyway. Given your experience, why do you assume those were anonymous? Was it fear of retaliation, or what do you think may have been the motivating factor?
I'm not sure exactly.
Okay.
I think that sometimes people feel that they don't want to throw other people under the bus, but it's just it's a small behavior that needs correction, and they don't want to be involved in giving their name.
Got it. They don't want it. And last question for me, and this is directed to Ms. Klein-Jimenez. Based on your experiences with colleges, given who the population you're dealing with, I'm curious about your perspective. We're going to hear about technological advancements and a couple of tools that are on the market next. I'm wondering, from your perspective, if technology is helpful with reporting.
I think it can be. I think when it comes to any large institution, whether it's a college or what have you, we need a comprehensive approach. And so that's going to include training, that's going to include changes to the environment, that might include technologically and application-based features. So I think that it definitely depends on what the goals are. It depends on what the culture is of the environment that you're trying to impact. But I certainly think that there can be a place for it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Leyva.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being with us today. I had a question. I think it was Ms. Klein-Jimenez that said we need to put strong policies in place. So I'm wondering how we do that when we have a zero tolerance policy here at the Capitol, but that really hasn't worked as we've seen. So what kind of strong policies do we put in place so that our zero tolerance policy actually works?
For for that question. It might not be an issue that the policy itself is not strong enough. But again, I think I mentioned that a toxic culture can really undermine even the best policy. And so both of those things really should be at play. Not only, and it's not necessarily that the policy might not be strong enough, but is the policy clear? Is it easy for folks to understand? Is it easy? Has it been communicated? Do people know that there's a zero tolerance policy? So I would look at that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Assemblymember Reyes.
Thank you. In some of the literature that Calcasa gave, and then also Ms. Nathan in your comments, you talked about bystanders. Is there specific training you give to bystanders and telling them what their responsibility is in reporting?
There is training out there for bystander reporting. However, it's something that we present to all employees and managers when we do any type of training, and in building the culture that voices matter, that this is an environment that is safe for all employees, and we treat each other with civility. So it's built in our culture. It is, inclusivity is one of our values. So we're surrounded by it, and we try to touch it every time we can. And empower our employees to behave in those ways.
We really look at bystander intervention from an advocacy and prevention standpoint. And so for so long, sexual violence has been this very private issue. It's not my business. I don't want to get involved. And so involving bystanders is really saying that this is a community issue. We all have a role in preventing sexual violence. And so it's really providing people with the tools and the knowledge to be able to intervene, whether it's verbal comments or a physical act that would cause harm.
When you talk about options, you talked about resources that are available and options. Once the person has made a report, and I'm not talking about an anonymous report, but a report of sexual harassment, are the options less at that point than do they have less options, or do they have more options at that point? In other words, if you do an anonymous report, you could still decide whether or not you're going to call the police. You could still decide so many other things, whether you're going to be involved or not. Once you've made the report, now are they in this system and they have to now go through everything that is being offered?
For us, when we receive a complaint about harassment, we try to create a space for that individual to feel comfortable enough to talk about all of that. And then one of the questions I will ask is, do you feel safe right now in the situation as we conduct this investigation and find out the specifics of what has occurred? So in that space of time, so that's why it's important to conduct the investigation in a timely manner, because you have to figure out what's happening, because that person is working around people that may have perpetuated in that act. So it's critical for HR department or whoever is handling your response to have that dialogue with the victim.
And I want to ask specifically about anonymous, if I may, anonymous complaints. I'm not understanding completely how that would happen. If someone wants to report sexual harassment and they call a hotline, is the investigation, you said earlier that those are soft complaints or soft investigations?
They have been. We haven't had many major, big issues. They've been, I just didn't like how this person said this.
So is an anonymous complaint treated the same as a face-to-face complaint normally?
So the way it's handled is we've hired a third party who receives the complaint, and they relay that information to us. And I'm able to send a response to this anonymous complainant without really knowing who they are. So we still can have dialogue without me knowing who's filed that complaint. and ask questions and maybe encourage them to come forward if it's a really grave incident that has happened to them. And then I provide the response after investigation and action has been implemented.
And is that information discoverable?
Yes, I mean, it's not cloaked under attorney-client privilege communication, so yeah, it is.
All right. So even though they are complaining anonymously through the legal process, eventually their identity could be determined?
I see what you're saying. That's a really good question for an attorney. I have not thought that through.
Because my question is, who is the owner of that information?
Right.
Is it the organization, like here, the state, that hires that entity to accept the anonymous complaints, or does it belong to that entity? That is a concern for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I don't know the answer to that, but I do have the resources to get that for you. I'm happy
Wonderful.
to follow up.
I think it's going to be an important factor. I know that we've started the Weave program, but that is important, because if we're saying we're keeping it anonymous, but it is discoverable legally, then they need to know. The victim that makes the report does need to know. Mm-hmm. I just an observation, when you were giving your talk, Ms. Nathan, a lot of what you said had to do with the letter C. Channels of communication, collegiality and trust, confidentiality, consistent procedures, comprehensive investigation, a culture of non-harassment, and civility. There's something about that letter C. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move to the next person up here, I just want to ask a question because something some member raised mentioned about the anonymous reporting. Here in the assembly side, when reports come in, there's actually a report put into a personnel file about all kinds of incidents and reports. How do you put anonymous reports in a personnel file somewhere? And if so, how do you have due process without the person who's been accused being able to even know who the individual is? Or do you only accept those for investigation, but I mean, how do you evaluate what you're going to do with that information given that it's anonymous?
So when we receive a report that is anonymous, and we do keep a file, it doesn't go into anyone's personnel file, it's kept separate, but we do try to see if there's any corroboration to the complaint that has been brought forward, and make the determination after doing a comprehensive investigation. And it depends what the situation is. It could be really grave, and it could be something about a comment someone made that was unwelcome.
You have nothing to add?
No, I don't.
Okay, Assemblymember Waldron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How should someone who witnesses sexual harassment proceed if the victim says they don't want to get involved, they don't want to report it? Is the confidentiality the way to go, or what have you seen? I mean, we want to encourage people who witness things to come forward and, speak out too. How would that be handled in the best way?
Sure. Well, again, from an advocacy perspective, if you're looking at what the survivor wants and what the survivor needs, and has clearly expressed that they did not wish to report the incident, from a trauma-informed standpoint, that taking what they have asked for and doing the opposite could be re-traumatizing. However, there are other ways that people might be able to address the situation. So can that person have a conversation with the person who, depending on the incident and what happened? Is there another way that they could perhaps instill something that could change the situation without having, this person told me that this happened, and really kind of throwing the survivor under the bus, if you will. So I think that when we look at it from an advocacy perspective, we really look at what the survivor wants. And if that means that they don't want it to be reported, doing so may cause that re-traumatization.
Is there the option, of someone to say, well, we were out, at a reception and so, whoever the person is, did this to an unnamed person?
Absolutely.
Because say there are other claims out there that you don't know about, it could actually help corroborate some of the other things being said without identifying the victim.
Absolutely. I think it's really important for people to observe what they're seeing and to be able to speak out against that, while also taking into account what someone who has suffered harm wants to see happen.
Just really quick, and you might have to help me figure out how to even phrase what I'm trying to ask. Since we've been starting these hearings, I think in November, we started hearing about issues that had occurred years ago, a year ago, or, nothing current even. And I guess this is more addressed at what happens with the perpetrator. We've seen in the past where nothing happens. They show up to work, there doesn't seem to be any issue, the victim has filed complaints, they're suffering, all these things happen, people are moved around, people are fired, all of that's in the past. And now we've kind of moved forward to this current time where, it's more like now people are stepping down, people are put on leave, people are unpaid, paid, kind of a different. What have you found in best practices when a complaint comes in, how the perpetrator is dealt with? Is it always a consistent, no matter what the claim, or how is that dealt with? I mean, is there a period of time when nothing happens while things are looking at it, or I don't know if I'm asking the right thing, because I want to be sure that we deal in a way that's effective with the perpetrator and not sure,
You have to find out if the complainant is working in close proximity and is going to be affected by the behavior as you go through the investigation. It's critical to make sure that the complainant is safe during that period of time. And depending on where they work, you might have to move people around for that temporary period. And that's why we want to conduct the investigations as quickly as possible and have a response ready and an action. If there's several complaints coming in about the same perpetrator, then that's a trail, and that needs to be addressed.
And I think, what we often hear from survivors is that nothing was done, that there was no accountability. And many survivors will say that they didn't necessarily want someone to maybe even be fired, be prosecuted, what have you, but they wanted that accountability. They wanted that acknowledgement that this actually did happen. So I think that from a survivor perspective, that is very important, that there is some level of accountability.
Yeah, and it reminds me a little of what we've heard from a few of the victims in this building, which is, and certainly a few staffers have told me that when they had filed complaints, the first thing they were asked to do by our HR department was, they've said, well, have you told him how this makes you feel? Which to me is just incredibly insensitive, and would not make anybody want to report if that's that they somehow are supposed to own or control or respond to their own harassment in that kind of way. Senator Morlock?
In dealing with best practices, I've been thinking about a chapter of my life many years ago, 2 decades ago, where I took over a department in Orange County, and the biggest complaint was that their investment policy statement was a joke. And so we decided to prepare a new investment policy statement. And we were told at that time, I believe it was the Municipal Treasurers Association of the United States and Canada, that they had a model on how you could prepare your investment policy statement. And I looked it up. I didn't see this 20 years ago, but they have 18 points of what should be in your IPS. And we even contacted people and said, boy, if we try to get certified, you know, what do we need to do to get the right number of points to get it certified? So we tried to build the model investment policy statement for the County of Orange, and we got the certificate after all that work. And it was like we were teased, like, oh great, now you have a certified policy, but we got it done. So I'm looking for the model. And so I'm assuming that you're both in some kind of HR association that's maybe national. And I haven't done the Google search yet, but what would that association be? And do they have a similar process of assisting in helping you provide the components of what a model sexual harassment or HR manual would look like?
I can answer that. I'm actually here today on behalf of Society for Human Resource Management, which is the largest organization that's national with 290,000 members, 25,000 here in California. And they have offices here in Sacramento, in fact. But they have they do provide assistance. They have a helpline where HR members can call and get information on best practices, on training. It's a world of information that's readily accessible to any HR professional. There's also local organizations. I believe there are some in Sacramento as well, HR associations that one can easily obtain guidelines on building policies.
So do they certify your policies?
They do, not that I know of, no certification of policies, but they have tried to emulate, and I'm blanking on the name, some best practices for reference, but not something that is certifiable.
Okay, and maybe trying to transfer one set of skills to another area, we would then have to abide by this investment policy statement, and if we were not in compliance, we would have to report those variances that maybe we bought the wrong, rated investment vehicle, whatever. And we even hired outside firms to check on our compliance. Is there a similar consulting group or some kind of industry group that reviews how you're managing to your policy?
I believe the IPS is under ERISA, EPSA, under DOL, that requires that organizations who do have a retirement plan have one in place. There's no such thing that I'm aware of. However, there are plenty of consultants who can assist in building policies and assisting with supporting in that endeavor.
So in that line of thinking, you've had an incident, you've researched it, you've investigated, you've met with the parties, you've come to a conclusion, and then you deal with it, termination or whatever the case is, and then it's over. Do you ever go back and ask those parties, was the process fair or was it appropriate? This is a dicey area, so there's a lot of emotions going on, but how do we know that what was done was maybe the best? Because this is difficult with emotions. But I'm just wondering, is there a review process?
Well, I'm not here representing an HR department, but I can say that at CalCASA, we have provided a lot of consultation and technical assistance to colleges and universities around their policies and best practices. And we do have some literature and resources that I'm happy to share with you all around that. I mentioned confidential climate surveys as a tool for looking at what does the climate look like? What are people experiencing? How are they feeling about policies that are in place or practices that are in place? So that might be a tool.
Okay. Then for the museum, you have 450 employees. Are any of them board members that are elected by a constituency?
We're under LA County, so we do. We're under the Board of Supervisors, and each supervisor has 2 members that are part of the.
So they're appointed by
yes,
the
they are
supervisor.
appointed.
You have 10 of them.
Exactly.
Okay.
We have
and
some
so-
appointed.
And you treat them just like they were an employee if they were.
No, we don't. They have their own separate orientation. That's different than, so it's not under my department. It's done separately.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out. We got two different categories here. Too. We have
That's true.
employees, and then we have electeds. So you have a separate policy then for the, I guess we'll call them appointeds?
I can check into that and definitely follow up with you on that information.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
It's an advisory board, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, theoretically, they're probably not in the weeds and on the premises that much except
No.
for meetings, but I'm just looking for a model.
Yeah.
Any other questions for this panel? Thank you very much for your input. Really,
Thank you.
really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
With that, I'm going to bring up our second panel. This panel's focus is on reporting sexual harassment and technological advancements. This is going to consist of Jeff Irvine, founder and president of Bridget.com, Beth Schroeder, co-founder of Kinder, and Leah Fleming, the Title IX coordinator for University of San Francisco. And as you make your statements, feel free to add any introductions that you feel are relevant, or any information about your backgrounds that might be informative as to your statements. And thank you again very much for participating today. Okay, I have Mr. Irvine as being the first one up at bat. And yes, if the sergeants could put new name badges, that would be helpful.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the committee for allowing us to speak today. I'm Jeff Irvine. I'm the founder of Bridget, which is a school safety, campus safety, workplace safety platform. Could you come a little closer to the mic, please? Oh, sorry. Better? Testing. Thank you. Again, I'm Jeff Irvine. I'm the founder of Bridget. We build school safety, campus safety, and business platforms all around creating social safety networks. I'm also here today with Dr. Glenn Lipson, who is one of our colleagues, and we work closely with him in the schools up and down the East Coast. I'd like Dr. Lipson to speak for a minute and introduce himself as well.
Okay, hello everybody. Oh, I have to push the button, which is this button. Okay. Again, hello everybody. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist, so by background I've been testifying for over 30 years in the areas of sexual harassment. Back in the late 70s, we created the first policy as I was a student in sexual harassment for the UC system. I've testified in cases that have involved banks, police departments, fire departments, schools, governments, entities. So it's an area that I definitely work at. I've dealt with binding arbitration clauses and someone's right to sue. That case went to the Supreme Court. I was an expert involved in that. And this is an area that I've worked in. I want to compliment the Assembly for what it has done with Assembly Bill 1825. Over the last couple of years, it added bullying in the workplace. And then this year, it added gender identity and gender diffusion as things that need to be discussed. I also believe that one of the central features in building safe workplaces is also focusing on ethics for government employees. That's your AB 1234 bill. And when you talk about what are appropriate relationships, those become very important. I was presenting with our now acting district attorney in San Diego, Summer Stephan, about the contributions of social media to sexual assault and sexual misconduct. That provided an opportunity to present this to the Stop Harassment, Abuse, and Rape Prevention of the U.S. Army. And through this work, I had an opportunity to meet Jeff Irvin, and as we're talking about the contributions of the World Wide Web to what's happening, the objectification of women, how you look at minorities and groups, one of the things that became apparent to me is we need to harness this sense of isolation, that people don't know how to act with each other anymore. They're not even conversing anymore. They're just texting, even when they're out on dates and they're in restaurants. How do we help people connect? That we need to use some of the same remedies and accomplish that through a platform that assists people in learning how to interact, reporting. And I was introduced through Jeff through insurance companies, because in my role I work with HR. I'm a member of the California Psychological Association. I belong to SHRM, deal with all those sorts of issues. And what I basically found in connecting with Jeff is that there were restorative practices in here, and this was brought up by this committee. We are looking at prevention. We don't want to come in as soon as they're victims. How do we help people pay attention so we catch things early enough where they don't progress to where there's a lot of harm? And we have found a generation that is more ready to send something. They see something, they send something, and we've created in this platform an ability to receive something that is supportive. And you're going to hear about that in terms of what we can accomplish. What we have seen online is the building of social movements so people do not feel alone. But we have a lot of people who do not know how to connect. And if we understand these pathways, we're able to prevent things. And one of the main pathways is the problem with alcohol, because many of these events take place when people are intoxicated. So we really need to understand how these things happen and how to respond and forearm everyone so they're forewarned and we avoid these types of events. So Bridget has subject matter experts like myself in order to say, what are the pathways? How can we do assessments? How can we collect data? How can we respond in real time where people feel supported? And what information can we provide them that they're able to make it through these events?
Madam Chair and Mr. Irvin, before you begin, if I could just ask you, we didn't have you included in the agenda, so before you leave, if you could give your full name to the sergeants and perhaps send us a bio later so it could be included in the record keeping of our agenda today. That would be very helpful for our process.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So backing up, to give you a little context, over the last 8 years, I've been working with a group of subject matter experts in the areas of psychology, Title IX, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, schools, educators, parents, teachers, and alike. And we built these platforms already and launched these platforms in schools across the country and in schools in California. And as everything that's been said before, it's all true. It's about all the C's. It's about trust. It's about understanding. But it's also about accountability. And so as we back up and we look at why has culture changed so dramatically in the last 10 years? And it has been in the last 10 years. And it's because communication has changed dramatically. And with that change in communication, the cultural change came. We at Bridget and Safer Campus and everything that we're doing, it's all around harnessing that same social technology, that same push technology, that same immediate feedback loop in order to create digital peer pressure, to create accountability, and create positivity in a restorative environment. Right now, we are all overrun immediately by the immediate post. There's no time to react. There's no time to correct. Public shaming is now the norm. Everything that gets posted that's not true and or hurtful or harmful, regardless of perspective, is public shaming and is the most divisive tool a human being has. So we come at this problem, and it's a global problem, in every culture, cutting across every race, every type of, everyone has the same problem around the world. So the whole idea is to change the culture, and it's about leadership at the top, but it's also about the leadership tapping the students or the members or the lobbyists or the bus drivers or the parents and empowering them to set the standards that you want in terms of the culture, to optimize culture. Very easy to say these words, very hard to do. Our platforms are built on the research of Dr. Dorothy Espelage. She's the leading researcher in bullying, harassment, and sexual harassment in the country for the last 22 years. She was out of the University of Illinois for 22 years, and now she works out of Florida. But her whole research was based on how do you create more positive school climates, right? And you can only do that by aligning the parent and teacher in the character education of the student. Same applies to any campus at the college level or to any workplace. So it's about setting standards and defining. To that end, as we look at sexual harassment, which we're focused on here today, and I've partnered with the We Said Enough group out of Sacramento because they happen to have a relationship with me, and I've been working in schools on privacy and issues along those ends. But as we focus on sexual misconduct and sexual harassment, you have to start by defining it and making it easy to define and easy to understand. And so as we put together our systems, we've wanted to do that on both a visual basis with icons that are non-threatening and non-triggering, but also with definitions that are understandable across all the various groups that are in the community. The other thing that we realized as we launched these platforms in different communities around the country is that you want the deterrent, you want prevention. Communities have always set standards on a face-to-face basis, and we've always been interpersonal and looked each other in the eye and had conversations until the phone came along, right? Now we don't have to look at people in the eye. We can just press the button, hit send, and maybe they got it, maybe they didn't, maybe they interpreted correctly, or maybe not. But if you can take that, if you realize that digital peer pressure is now achievable, right? Face-to-face peer pressure has always been achievable. If we're in this room, we're all going to act a certain way. But if you can create digital peer pressure, accountability, transparency, then all of a sudden things start to get better because you've changed the risk-reward around the bad behavior. You've brought them out of the anonymous dark into the light. And in doing that, you now start to have a different conversation. The other thing that we can benefit from in terms of mobile technology is data. I mean, data works. We use it in so many positive ways right now around the world. We can do it around sexual harassment, abuse, bullying, harassment, and you can do it by starting to gather this data ahead of time and often. And if you can gather that data, you can start to see trends. And as you start to see trends, you can become predictive. And that allows leadership to set policy and direct limited resources more effectively. I look at the world as everything's a transaction. I look at you, I smile, you smile back, that's a positive transaction. I look at you, you don't smile back, that's a neutral or negative. It's hard the number of transactions on a behavioral level that go on every day that can be construed and or misconstrued, phenomenal numbers, right? Not something that you can generally manage from a top-down strategy, but it is something where it can be from a community-wide standard where everyone's watching each other's back. So for all these reasons, we spent a lot of time working with all the various groups, from the insurance companies on the financial side to legislators to leading legal minds on privacy and libel to put together a platform that actually could work to everyone's interest. And so today I'm going to show you a short video on the We Said Enough app, which we are going to launch sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And that app is designed to gather data, not point a finger at who did it, but understand the metrics and the expansiveness of the problem as it relates not only in California but around the world. And with that data, which we'll share with researchers and legislators around the world on a de-identified basis, start to set better policies and more informed policies. To that end, so why don't I play the video, because I've talked too much, and then we can go from there. This is my first time, so we'll see.
Welcome to We Said Enough, a digital platform that creates a community of survivors, volunteers, and activists who can provide immediate social support to victims of sexual harassment, abuse, and bullying, along with the needed restorative resources to begin the healing process. To file a report, press on the plus button at the bottom of your screen and answer the questions that are proposed. When did the incident happen? Was it middle school, high school, college, or in the workplace? How were you involved? I was the victim, I participated, I saw it. What was your relationship with the aggressor? Was it someone you knew? A teacher, a relative, or supervisor? The owner of a business? Were you physically threatened? Yes or no? How would you describe what happened? Select verbal abuse, harassment in the workplace, hostile work environment, unwanted touching, reputational shaming, and humiliation. From there, you can select where it happened, at the workplace, online, at a bar after work, or on an airplane, on a business trip. Now let's talk about the power balance in the relationship in terms of the work environment, and then in terms of whether it is physical or purely social in nature. Was there anyone who witnessed the incident? Did everyone know? Just me? Or a few people? After that, you can write in any other details that you may want to incorporate that may serve as a reminder to you as you continue to review everything and put it in. Now agree to the terms and conditions, and before you submit the report, the system will ask you if you'd like some help. If you do, it automatically suggests potential helplines, centers, and resources to help you begin to heal and cope. The We Said Enough Help Map is designed to show the users of the community that they're not alone. Each time a report is documented, it is automatically added to the map based on the location of the person documenting the incident of sexual misconduct. Each number of the map is associated with the total number of reports filed in that area. As a user zooms in and out, the dots either break down into smaller numbers or consolidate into fewer, larger numbers. When a user clicks on a dot, they receive an anonymous breakdown on all the recorded incidences of sexual misconduct within that particular area. In the upper right-hand corner of the map, there are filters that allow the user to look at the map over any time frame or any type of misconduct. From the dashboard, anyone can go to the Community Report section to view reports made anonymously. Here, they can show their support by pushing on the Me Too or I Support You button, creating a community of love and support with every click. For the first time anywhere, victims, survivors, and witnesses around the world can share experiences in real time and have access to the support that they need. In order to donate to the We've Said Enough Foundation, simply click on the menu in the lower left-hand corner and then click Donate.
We don't need to say donation. It was a little hard to see. It was a little hard to see, but it's all icon-based. There's definitions for everything. Making it easy to communicate a problem accurately at the time the problem's happening, at the time the boundary crossing is happening, and record it, and then leave it up to your choice as to whether you're going to report it now or at a later date. That's empowering. Having feedback loops when you've been harassed in a certain way and someone else can identify you with you and support you, all of a sudden you know you're not alone. And we know the most important thing when you've been harassed or abused or beaten up or bullied is to immediately find support, whether within your community, within your family, or elsewhere. And so these tools are just that. They're tools. They're communication tools, but they're also, boundary tools, which we have on a face-to-face level by default. On a digital level, we can now have them.
Thank you. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions for you in a minute. We're going to move on to Ms. Schroeder.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity. Madam Chairwoman, Ms. Friedman, and Ms. Mitchell, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity and the Rules Committee. My name is Beth Schrader, and I'm here as the co-founder of Kender and part of the technology panel, but I am anything but a technology specialist. I need my children to help me unjam my computer. My background is as a labor and employment specialist. I've been a partner in a law firm, and I've been practicing labor and employment law for the last, I hate to say it, 33 years. So that is my background. And I have been honored to be a part of the development of an app called Kender, which is launched a little under a month ago. And I came up with the idea for Kender because out of my frustration of being a labor and employment partner and attorney and watching people not bring reports of sexual harassment and other things forward. We did not develop Kender as a sexual harassment app. It's sort of ironic that we are at this watershed moment in time and are sitting here before a group of you esteemed colleagues looking at this issue, and that we're here and with this issue and this interesting point in time, the Me Too movement. But we actually started the development of Kender about a year and a half ago. it's my experience, because I actually work with business owners in California. In fact, I've been here on several occasions meeting with many of you representing business owners, that usually my clients as business owners want to do the right thing when claims of harassment come up and claims of other kinds of issues of racial harassment or other kinds of wrongful conduct, once they know about those issues. But too often those issues don't arise, don't come to the right people, and that people don't bring those claims forward. In fact, the acting chair of the EEOC, I think, recently said that they believe that only 1 in 4 claims of harassment, sexual harassment, are made, and the rest of them are not made. When I take depositions of people in lawsuits, and they testify that they don't bring their claims forward before filing lawsuits, usually it's because, for example, they couldn't find the 800 number, or they didn't know how to reach the HR people, or they lost their handbooks that I draft. And it's very frustrating, because I spend a lot of time drafting those handbooks that people can't find. The policies are great. I know how the policies are written. They're great compliant policies, I can tell you. But people lose those policies. They get them, they read them, and then they toss them aside. No one has the policies. So, I wanted to find a way that people wouldn't lose the policies. People wouldn't lose those 800 numbers. People wouldn't say they couldn't get a hold of the people that actually were there to help them. So one day, out of frustration, after listening to people testify over and over in a large class action I was involved in, I woke up in the middle of the night and said, how are we going to help these people not lose those phone numbers and those 800 numbers and those hotline numbers? And I thought, you know what people never lose these days? Their phones, their iPhones. So I thought, you know what, someone should come up with an app and make it impossible for people, pretty much these days, to lose something. So a year and a half ago, I thought of this idea, and we started the development of what is now Kinder. And I don't disagree with anything that anybody in this room has said today about the importance of training, the importance of working with victims, of the importance with creating a culture of respect, because I do all those things. I work with managers, I train managers, I train staff. I have spent more time in the last few months, by the way, training staff and managers than I want to tell you. I could probably do this full time now. And by the way, big supporter of AB 1825 too, and all of the changes over the last few years. Because I do think it's important to go into the workplaces and work with employees and managers and do all of those things. I see our app as only an added part of all of that. But one thing we do bring to the table is the ability of employees to reach out and get a hold of someone when maybe in the middle of the night they're losing sleep and they can't find another way to do it. Because, as been said by my colleagues to the left, sometimes these days people just want to text. They can't walk into a room. And our app gives people the option of switching the button to the left and making it anonymous. It isn't automatically anonymous, but they can create a profile with their name on it, and at any time they can make it anonymous. And then you can choose to continue the conversation with them in an anonymous fashion. Now, our app does not necessarily characterize anything as harassment. In fact, we have 3 options. They say you can make a suggestion, you can ask a question, and you can ask for help. Because we don't assume that this is a sexual harassment reporting. Remember, I didn't develop it that way. This is just a communication tool. Because we believe in employee engagement. We think that opening up communication is what makes employees feel more fulfilled. In fact, all the millennials studies have shown that employees want to be engaged. That's what makes people feel good about being a part of the workplace. And in general, that makes people feel valued and increases productivity in the workplace, and that's where we're coming from. But of course, part of this whole issue, these days has been harassment, and it can contribute to that issue too. So, as part of this committee, of course, that's what we're addressing, and it can be used for that too. So, we have a short video. Usually we do these live, and I apologize again, since technology is my strength. I'm going to press this. which is our little pre-recorded video. And, yeah, so this is, okay. Make it full. Great. So this would be a screen that you would get, hold on, let me go back real quick. All right, so you can, all right, let me go back a little bit. Can I go back? Yeah, just slide it up.
You have to click on the sound bar for moving it. There you go.
Yeah. Can I do that?
You hit play again.
We'll take it.
You hit the sound
Okay, perfect. All right, so we'll start. Okay, so this would be how it would come up once you have your profile established. And you have the options. I have an idea, I have a question, I need help, and you could click on any of those. And they would get filed. There's an employer dashboard that would be on the employer's side. So depending on which one of these comes up, it would get filed, separately, and you could organize it separately. So the employee would choose it. And then at that point, let's say this is I need help, which would probably be how it would be registered if it's a harassment complaint. So they can show their name, and then their name would come up. And at that point, they can pick who the message goes to. Now, when the employer sets it up, or whoever, by the way, it's very flexible how it's designed. So if it were for a group like this, you can decide who the messages would get sent to. And it would be shown both the person's name and their job title. Because, for example, for some companies, you may know somebody as human resources, or you may know them by their name. So we would want them to know. And an employee may feel comfortable letting everybody in that group get a copy, but they may say, wait a minute, I don't want this person to get a copy because I have a problem with that person. So I'm going to deselect one or a couple of those people. So you can deselect some of these people, but not all of them, because those would be the people who would normally get a copy. Then there are people called reviewers, who would be like your CCs. So, for example, I do a lot of work with restaurants. So those people would be more, for example, maybe your GCs or your HR people, but maybe I want my manager at the restaurant to get a copy. Now, I may not want my manager to get a copy, but that would be my choice. And you could make that choice. It also would show your location. Now, if you go to hide my name, for example, that would make it anonymous. Once it's anonymous, I don't know if I get a copy who that person is. It comes up anonymous. Now, at any point in the anonymous conversation, if I'm the person sending the message, I can choose to reveal my name. As you see it there, as anonymous, no one will know your identity unless you later choose to reveal it. Because as the conversation is going forward, I may decide I feel comfortable enough that I want to reveal my identity, but I may not, and that's completely on me as the person sending the message. So you can see here, then send a message to, and you'll get the choice of who the person gets sent to, and they'll get those choices. So they get different options and they can send it to. By the way, you can also, as we'll see in a minute, there are options as the different languages you can send it in. I think we're up to like 12 different languages you can send in by clicking on the translate button. And these are the different locations you can send it to if there are different locations that the company has. Then once it's chosen, you can send a message. And then there's an immediate message that is sent. That's the anonymous message. They'll get an immediate message sent, and then, of course, there'll be a customized message that's sent by, obviously, the employer, who gets pinged immediately. Now, they can send photos as well, or videos, if they need to, because we obviously know that sometimes those are things that they need to attach or to send. There may be pieces of evidence. There may be things that they want us to see in the workplace. So that can get attached. And then this would be the inbox that the employee would have, that would have their messages as well, organized. And then there's also a copy of handbook policies. So if the employer has handbook policies or forms or anything that they want on the phone, that would be a copy, so they would always have access to that, so their resources are always there and tagged in any organizational manner that the employer wants them to see them. Again, because I get frustrated that nobody ever keeps copies of their handbooks that we work so hard to write. So there they are as well. Now, then, in addition to that, this would be a copy of what the employer dashboard would look like. So the employer dashboard is an entire case management system, which is all of the messages that are kept, and it can be organized and filed by the employer. They can be tagged, so they can be, normally I would have a whole demo for you, but you can be tag them, color-coded and searchable. And then what we also have now, as we're doing in version 2, is you can keep notes, and you can share the notes. So you can keep notes alongside the whole time in real time, so you make notes alongside, and then you can also have the other people who have access to this can also share notes amongst themselves. Then, of course, you can export all of that if you need to have someone, like your attorney, have access to all of that. So it becomes an entire case management system. So again, we don't expect that communicating by an app is going to ever replace human interaction. I would imagine that this is something that would be your first step in an investigation, and then we would hope that people would come in and have a live interaction. But there may be circumstances where people never reveal themselves, and then you're going to have communication in this. Obviously, then you're going to have other witnesses and things that are part of an investigation. It's going to be an interesting, part of our metrics to look and see how we continue to investigate with claims that remain anonymous 100% of the time. That's something we haven't had a lot of interaction with, but we'll learn as we go. But one thing we will be able to do is increase our ability to get information and hopefully increase people coming forward so that we don't look at 1 in 4 people coming forward in these harassment claims, and we'll increase this to maybe 2 or 3 out of 4 people coming forward. And that's what we're looking at. What we will be doing down the line as well is being able to also increase the ability of this and use it for things like taking surveys. I think there's been some discussion about that, and increasing our ability to measure metrics as well about things like not just sexual harassment, but employee engagement, employee moods. How are employees feeling about certain issues in the workplace? Those are all things that we're going to be doing down the road with our development to this. But again, it's another way to engage our employee workforce and take the temperature of the employees in the workplace. And as, like I said, my colleagues to the left said, this is a way that employees are communicating with us these days, so we want to be able to take advantage of that communication technology. Thank you very much for allowing us to present to you today.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fleming.
Great. Can you pass me the mouse?
Mm-hmm.
Or the clicker?
Yeah, hold on. Yeah.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leah Fleming. I am the Title IX coordinator at the University of San Francisco. And my role here is to discuss with you a little bit about our institution. We're a Jesuit institution, Catholic college. And our Title IX office has been in place about 3 years. So like many universities in this coming age of many more reports, before this, many complaints around sexual misconduct that were presented to the university would either go through HR or the student conduct office. Now, most college campuses do have Title IX offices that have been implemented on their universities to do education, prevention, as well as training for the institution and anything else that arises. So here at the University of San Francisco, my role is to do all of the above. I'm specifically going to talk to you today about different opportunities in which we engage our students, and a lot of that encompasses social media and apps and letting them be aware of what those may look like. So I'm sure everyone in this room knows what Title IX is. Specifically on our college campus, it protects students from sexual harassment, dating violence, stalking. And the issue, though, is many students don't know what that is. All of these campuses have Title IX offices. but they don't know what sexual harassment looks like. They don't know what stalking looks like. They don't know the definitions of those things. So for college camps, it's really important to, yes, have a policy, but making sure your students understand and know what that policy looks like and what's the role of that on college campuses. So before our students even enter our campus here at the University of San Francisco, and we've talked about this for other agencies as well, is they have to do a course that we call Talk About It. And it is an online platform. It goes over drugs, alcohol, and Title IX before they even come to our campus. So before you can check into your residence hall on move-in day, you have had to have completed this course. Then once they get on campus, the first person that they see, they go through, meeting their roommates. But before they get to go sleep in their lovely beds, they meet me. And we talk about, for about 5 minutes before they enter the residence halls, we have a new video initiative called We Got You. And it goes over all of the issues that are happening on college campus, because something may happen that night. They may get invited to a party that night. We want them to know all of the resources available. So we do that video. And then guess what? About 5 days later, they have freshman orientation. Mm-hmm. And they're going through a 2-hour orientation on not just Title IX, but diversity, microaggressions, bias, and what does that look like on this college campus? If I experience this, how do I report it? Who do I go to? And so all of those things are initiatives that we talk about. Our policy at the University of San Francisco encompasses all of these things. Many times when you hear in the media, students go, well, sexual assault, but they don't know what sexual harassment looks like. They're not able to define what stalking looks like. So we go over what all of these are, because all of these are policy violations, and we want to create a campus, an environment where our students feel comfortable coming forward and being able to report these issues that are happening. So one of the big pieces that we focus on, and we know a lot that's happening, is there's all different media platforms that are being brought up. So you can see on Google, they have this database where they're just able to write everything on a Google database saying this is what's happening. On college campuses, there are all types of apps that are going around. And so we encourage our students to use what works for them. There are consent apps. 3 of the ones that we have our students use are We Consent, if that's something that they want to use. There's also Legal Fling, which is a new app as well. But some of these apps are very problematic when it comes to if I can go on an app and I get consent from you via that app, but then I can get in that room and I can definitely change my mind. So we want to encourage students, but we know that our students are using Tinder, they're using SoulSwap, they're using medias of dating, social online medias of dating, so they are also 9 times out of 10 going to use other social medias for reporting as well. So the issue, we know this already, that 1 in 5 college women are sexually assaulted, 1 in 12 college men, and 1 in 4 that identify as trans or gender nonconforming are sexually assaulted on a college campus. In your department here, just thinking of that, probably individuals who work in your workplaces have been sexually assaulted or have been in some type of incidents. And so knowing that in different situations, the triggers that occur, comments that are said that are harassment, to many people, oh, that's not a big deal. But for somebody who may have been sexually assaulted in their time prior in their college experience, you're not going to know that. And so that's really important as we transition as our students. We also say you're transitioning from college, you're going to go someplace else. But how are we having those conversations? How are we changing the culture, not just on college campuses, but in workplaces as well? And so why don't people report? We've talked about this, and I heard this in the other panel. They don't think it's serious. They may have a criminal past. Many of our students may be immigrants. They may be coming from different countries. We have a lot of international students here at the University of San Francisco, and there's some concern about that. If I report this, what is this going to look like, not just for me, but for the other individual? But we do know that 90% of assaults are committed by perpetrators that are continuous. And so that's an issue on a college campus. And so for here at the University of San Francisco, we've used Callisto, which is a new reporting app. Not even just an app, it's a website. You can use it on your phone as an app, but it is a website. It has support services. Students can click on there. They get all the support services specifically for the University of San Francisco, the city of San Francisco. But the great thing about Callisto, and all of you up there do have the resources that were passed out, is an individual can go in there and save details. So when I talk to my students, I'll give you an example that I give my students. Many of you may have seen or may have heard of the music artist Drake, very popular, just had a music video that came out. So I will tell my students, if I was out at a club and I met Drake, I would be very excited. I'd want to tell everybody about it. I maybe want to journal about it. And so in Callisto, which is a private database, many of our students keep their notes on their phones. They have an online diary, they have a journal. Not the safest thing if you're in a stalking relationship or in your domestic violence situation. that person can easily get into all of your information. Callisto allows for the individual to go in and create a private password as well as a paraphrase. It's very hard to get into that situation, but they can go in and they can just journal. I went on a date. It was great, amazing. They can talk about whatever they want to talk about. And if situations don't go well, so if a stalking situation does occur, you can go in Callisto, you can track those behaviors. Because we know many times with survivors of sexual assault or survivors of sexual misconduct, there is trauma. There's memory where they forget. So by tracking these incidents, good, bad, and different, if something does happen, we don't have to go back and ask those questions. Well, what happened in your freshman year? They have this information there. And so what happens there is the students can go in and they can save the details, and it's just there for them. They can go in and edit at any point. They can go in and delete at any point. Or what they can do is they can decide, you know what, I want to report this right now. They can click report, and that gets sent directly to my office as the Title IX coordinator. I'm the only person who has access to that. The other great thing about Callisto, which I think is very intriguing to many, is that there's the option to wait for others. We know many times survivors of any type of sexual misconduct, any type of harassment, they do not want to report because they feel like this may have just happened to me. But if this was happening to somebody else, if this was a repeated pattern, I would want to do something. And so Callisto allows for an individual to write the first, last name, and we use Facebook URL, but other campuses use email addresses, and if they're also now in the tech role, they use email addresses, that if somebody else puts the first name, the same first, last name, in the Facebook URL, what happens is myself as a Title IX coordinator, I will get all of those reports. They will also get notified that there is a match. So it allows for there to be power in numbers, because we know many times individuals may not want to speak up because there's this fear that this is just happening to me. So this is just the outer face of Callisto and what it looks like. It's You're Not Alone. So at the top there you can see where it says reporting options. So they can choose to report here. They can choose to use our online database. We're a college campus, so they can choose to report anonymously there if they want to. They can come in to our office. They can call. So one thing to remember, though, with reporting is to have all types of options. Callisto for us is just another tool in our toolbox. Students can use, faculty and staff can use multiple ways of reporting, and it's really just what works for them. But here's also, they can see support services. On the inside, the internal route, what I love about Callisto is as a Title IX coordinator who's doing all the prevention education, I'm able to see when students are using Callisto. So for us, I'm able to see, unfortunately, after spring break every year, I have a lot of reports. I'm able to see that. Last year at USF, Cinco de Mayo. We don't know why. That was the first time, but we had an uptick of reports. The beginning of the semester, what we call on college campuses, called the first 6 weeks. That's where we know across college campuses, that's when most sexual assault, most sexual misconduct does occur. So through Callisto, I'm able to see what's happening on my campus. I'm able to see what pages people are going to. So, they're going to go how to support a friend. Our most commonly used page is because we're training our students not just to report for themselves, but how can you help your roommate? How can you help your teammate? And then this page here is how students can go in. So this is how to create their password. They need to confirm it if they're a student, creating their email address. And then they can, once they've created the document here, you can see where it says edit. They can download the PDF. They can delete it if they don't want to go through it anymore. They can report it now or wait for others. The great thing about this too is once they do decide to submit it, we get all of that information. And so if we are moving forward to an investigation, we don't have to start with, tell me what happened. I already have your document, your PDF. I know what happened. So we're able to gauge, so it's not re-triggering survivors are coming forward and starting over. Also, just the questioning within Callisto is very trauma-informed. We know oftentimes things do not happen in chronological order. So our questions don't go in chronological order as well. So just on a university campus in total, we're taking a campus-wide approach. Everybody needs to be involved in order for this to work. So from when they first enter in the residence halls to whether they're working with their prevention educators to our athletics, everybody on our campus does get trained. From our freshmen when they first enter to faculty and staff who are mandatory reporters to our student leaders. They know and are knowledgeable about our resources. They know our policy that's available for them. And so they have a lot of references. And across campus, there are bulletin boards. And so really translating that into various aspects just so that students know and are aware of their reporting options is going to be important, because if they don't know, they're not going to report. And then changing the culture is important. Here at the University of San Francisco, before this office was developed in 2015, we had about 16 reports that were submitted on a college campus. We definitely know more than 15 incidents of sexual misconduct were happening. But students didn't know where to go. There wasn't trust and says, I'm not going to HR as a student. I don't want to go to student conduct. Why would I go to the disciplinary office? So by creating an office specifically for sexual misconduct reporting has definitely increased our reporting to where this semester, even right now, we're already over 100 reports. So we've definitely seen a transition, and there's also a lot of more trust. We're doing education. You all know April's coming up, the Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So we're doing a lot of education throughout the year that informs students of what are their options for reporting, knowing the policy, understanding what that policy looks like. And a lot of that does involve tech. By providing multiple ways. Yes, some people like to do things in person, but many of our students are on their phone all day, every day. And even some of our education prevention, we're doing Snapchat filters. We're saying messages, hey, we heard what's happening over here in Hayes. We can see that. We can see the inappropriate writing on the dashboard. So we start having conversations and using social media to really reach people where they're at. And this is just our process here, but that's just our information here, specifically around Callisto, but taking the college campus approach to all that we do. So thank you again for allowing me to present here, and any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those.
Really, really interesting. Let me just ask, just so I understand from each of you, you all of these different apps have sort of notes components where people can type things in. What happens when if they type in the names of perpetrators with each of yours?
So in our systems, they're closed systems, so it's an opt-out system because we found that opting in is really hard to do, right?
No, I don't mean their names, the names of
the perpetrators.
Yes.
If the perpetrator's name is listed in there, then it has to be followed up with, and a process that has to go on that goes on within the company or within the school.
And is any of that can that be publicly seen in any of these applications?
No, it's all closed. All the moderators who receive the reports are trained in what the law is federally, on a state level, Title IX, Title VII, and what the whistleblower laws are in every state, because identity threat is the biggest threat that we all face today. So understanding that you have to do an investigation that is safe and non-threatening to both the victim and to the aggressors or perpetrators. So as in our systems, not only do you get reported what went on and who was involved, you then do your actual investigation. Everything's tracked in a timeline, everything you did, and then the system automatically suggests restorative processes, next steps, making the right choices. And so those involve everything from helplines to conversations to lessons, both for the victims and for the aggressors, because the victims obviously need support services, and there's follow-up under Title IX that you have to do. And on the aggressor side, we believe in restorative discipline for the lesser infractions. It's an opportunity to learn and to understand. So that's how our process works.
So that's in Bridget and not the system you built?
No, it's in both. So in the system we built, everything's meta-tagged in terms of sexual harassment resources, support resources, state and local. The communities can upload and meta-tag all their own information in real time. Policies and procedures can all be uploaded, meta-tagged, and pushed, because push technology is the key. No one wants to find anything anymore. Any type of static website or opt-in approach, which is what I call static, doesn't get maximum engagement. In order to change community culture and behavior, you want to start with everyone being in the system. If someone wants to opt out because they don't want to be in a drop down or something like that, that's fine. But if you start from 100% and you end up at 90% versus starting at 5% and trying to get to 10%, the desired impact on culture, digital peer pressure, and accountability is completely different. It's like when you get your license, you can opt in to giving your eyes and giving your organs in the US, so we get 5% participation. Overseas, in Scandinavia, you opt out and they get 95%. So it's all about making it easy, right? Making the choices easy. Simplest path is always the path we want. So as we built this, we built it as choice architects. What's going to make it easiest for the victim, the aggressor, the bystander, the person on the Title IX coordinator who has to address it, the police who have to get involved or don't have to get involved, the parents who have to follow up, and so on. So you have to game theory every scenario that's out there and figure out, okay, where are we going to end up here? And you have to be able to figure out the risk-reward of starting that process at the beginning. So informing your students, your employees, your lobbyists, hey, here's the risk of he said, she said, right? Without witnesses, with witnesses. And here's what happens when this particular event takes place. And so here are the three things. You have this choice. And Title IX, if you allege being sexually harassed or raped or date raped, right, you have three choices. You can go to the Title IX coordinator, you can handle it internally, security can handle it on campus, or you can go to the police. All of these have to be given to the alleged victim at the time, and they then have to agree that they're going to do one or three or none and communicate that back to the university. So we built all these check loops into our push technology. Again, we're trying to move the risk off the institutions back to the individuals in terms of accountability across the board, whether it's schools, whether it's campuses, whether it's corporations.
With our app, the communication is solely between the employee and the employer, so it's always confidential and everything's encrypted. We have all of the data completely secure, so it's a complete direct line. So any names, any photos, anything that's transmitted is completely secure. So it would be just one-way communication. So there's no issue about anything being breached.
And the same for Callisto, if a student chooses to, because they don't have to report it, they can use, in writing, you can choose that as your way to embrace your voice and your healing without reporting. But once the student does choose to report that information to our office or wait for others and we receive that report, we do have the perpetrator's names. What happens then is I contact the survivor first to let them know that we have received a report, to come over to our office. We go over support options, resources, whatever they may need to move forward in their process and start their healing. And then we go over options for them as far as what they want to do next. So did they just want us to have this report? Do they just want support only and resources? Would they like to move forward with the formal investigation? Or they like to move forward with the conflict resolution, which is a lower level situation? But for our, especially in Title IX, if we have multiple reports with the same individual, we may move forward regardless of what the survivor may want, because we also have an obligation to protect the community and the university of other students.
Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, Mr. Irvin, I saw a presentation on the system you are building in collaboration with We Said Enough this weekend in San Diego. And as it was presented, and as I understood it, it would be a data collection tool, because the argument made was that we don't have data collection. We don't have a sense universally of the number of sexual harassment victims across the board. And so the tool being built, I didn't understand that it would be a tool that could actually launch investigations or be a case management tool used by employers. So to get back to Assemblymember Reyes's question about then who owns the data. So help clarify for me what the tool you're building, because our background information is on Bridget. So on the tool you are working in collaboration with We Said Enough will be to do what?
Okay. There's two questions there. So the first one is we build a platform technology, right? And on that platform technology, it can extend to any community. I can create a native app for the California legislature in 6 weeks' time, both Android, and you can upload whatever your materials are and what you're looking to capture. Mm-hmm. We Said Enough came to us specifically and asked us, what we thought about building an app where you would name people and all that, and we were like, you want to gather the data. So the whole idea behind the We Said Enough app, which is a separate application, is to do just that. Any user, any female, male, transgender, whatever affiliation, father, mother, can input any boundary crossing or sexual harassment that they've either experienced or they've seen Like my daughter's been sexually harassed in college X number of times, I could put those in. And we gather with great granularity the type of sexual boundary crossing or sexual misconduct that went on. We also gather the periodicity. So we gather, did it start in elementary school? Did it go in middle school, high school, college, graduate school, the workplace? Because there is no good data out there on these things. And so the idea with We Said Enough was to launch this app to the world for free, starting probably use April 1st because it's Sexual Harassment Awareness Month, but we could do it this week if we wanted to. And the whole idea is to have everyone out there populate their experiences that they've ever had, as long as it's non-triggering, that they want to share both now and in the past, and then also that they've been a part of, whether it's been my daughter or a friend or someone else, to really map a landscape of pain, harm, so people understand the breadth of this issue and the depth. And when I say people, men, women, everyone, because it's up to all of us to be able to address this.
And so now I'm clear between We Said Enough app that's forthcoming and Bridget app that exists. So you build it, I populate. I guess I can't name names because it's data collection.
You can't name names in this one. You can't name perpetrators.
My experience,
right?
And where does that data go? You said in your intro, policymakers, college presidents.
It goes into a lot.
How do you access it and do you roll it out and kind of tell the world in 30 days?
You roll it out on we roll it out on a de-identified basis, so it's always protected. We're not selling the data. We're not redistributing the data for any other reason. We have researchers who may want to mine the data on a de-identified basis because we feel as though that'll be beneficial to society, so we actually want to do that. We'll publish the data in real time on our maps so that there's a constant awareness of the problem.
Got it. As we talk about our need to affect culture change and implicit bias kind of focus, this would be a data point that we could have a broader understanding about.
Look, I think everyone should take the IAT on the Harvard website. I've taken it 50, 30, too many times. We've written about it, and because everyone has their implicit biases, and you will always have them. It's learning how to manage your explicit bias.
Right.
And having those conversations. And by the way, orientation at every level is one of the key factors to setting climate. Whether you're going into 6th grade for the first time, whether you're joining the state legislature, whether you're a new lobbyist, whether you're starting off as a freshman at school, that orientation period is such a critical point at which to address this.
That's true. And I would challenge folks to, there have been a number of bills that were introduced in the legislature about anti-bullying. And I was a member of the assembly when many of those bills were debated and heard city members of the legislature talk about how people should just man up and bullying wasn't that big a deal. And so the reason I talk about implicit bias is because I've lived here and experienced it and heard it firsthand. And so now we all seem to be singing the same song about, ain't it a shame? But folks need to be held accountable about what they thought and what they viewed.
A great read is Whistling Vivaldi, for those of you who have read it. It's a great read.
Let me move on to Ms. Schroeder. In terms of how many companies are actually using Kinder, and what's the feedback you're getting?
We only have a couple right now because we just launched. Interestingly, most of the employee claims that have come in so far are not about sexual harassment at all, and probably not surprising. A lot of them are just management issues, day-to-day. I don't like the way this person's looking at me or treating me, or I wouldn't even call them bullying issues, just conflict in the workplace issues, but honestly, I think this presents a great pressure valve. The first client we launched it at is a client that I've had for years, and they have a traditional 800 number hotline, and they told us that they normally get a couple of phone calls a month out of the 800 number, and the amount of hits they got on Kinder was quite a bit more, even in the first couple of weeks. So the engagement level, we think, is going to be a lot higher, but honestly, just the sort of disgruntled employee sort of the grumbling level that I'm feeling amongst my client employee base has been growing in the last few months, maybe 18 months. So I think this could be a really interesting pressure valve, steam valve, kind of thing that I think will help, even if it's not sexual harassment, just to sort of let employees vent. And when I'm hearing from people using it, the HR people like it because they like to be able to read things and have time to get back to people, is what they're telling me. So they're finding it really interesting. Like I said, we've only been around for a few weeks, so it's still very new. But so far, people are really enjoying working with it because it's allowing people to vent. It's allowing the employers to get back to people. We'll have to see when we get into some of the heavy lifting, again, because it's so new. But it's been, and we're getting a lot of really interesting interest from the employer base nationwide. I was sort of fascinated by the outreach we've been getting. But obviously, like I said, it's a new app because it's new technology. But so far, very intrigued with the response. And we'll have to see how it goes, but very encouraging.
Thank you. And I would just say, Ms. Fleming, we've come a long way. When I think about my first day as a freshman, no one said anything about anything. You had to find the nurse's office on your own. I remember we had a rape crisis center on campus, and we didn't know about it or even know where it was until someone was raped on campus and we had to figure it out. So it's wonderful to hear what the experience is now and how proactive we are being in terms of making sure students have the information they need to protect themselves. That's wonderful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
We have a nurse's office?
My college campus had one.
Oh,
okay. And yes, the Capitol has one on the 5th floor by the members elevator. I'll take and show you.
Assemblymember Reyes.
Thank you. Some statistics were shared, and it's clear, to me anyway, that there isn't enough data to be able to tell what the statistics are here in the Capitol. Like you talked about, 1 in 5 women raped on college campus, 1 in 12 men, 1 in 4 trans. Those don't necessarily reflect here in the Capitol, right? This is on college campuses?
Correct.
So you've already been able to gather data to be able to provide that information. When you say that 90% of sexual offenders are repeat offenders, again, that's data that has been collected?
Yes, that's data that's been collected, and that's national data that's been done. And so, organizations through Title IX, like ATICSA, various organizations have collected this data, and it's known, but it's not specific for the Capitol, but around college campuses. In college campuses, specifically at USF, we do climate surveys that go out to our campus to figure out what's happening on our campus, to gather this information. But the information that was shared to you is national data through the ATICSA organization.
Then it begs the question, if 90% are repeat offenders, what is happening the first time they offend and the second time they offend?
Yeah, and from college campuses, we know students aren't reporting. Students feel like it is an isolated event, and so they're not reporting that information. But then once one person does, especially on a college campus, what we have is we call the rumor mill, where we have one student says, I've experienced this, and someone else says, I've experienced that too. We realize it's the same person and the same individual. And so that's why at the college campus we're looking at climate. And so Callisto allows for us, and we have other forms of reporting as well. So we have Maxient, which is a database where students can go and report, staff and faculty can go and report incidents, and we track behaviors. So if I get 2 incidents of the same student, we're outreaching to that individual, and we're saying, hey, regardless of if the survivor victim wants to come forward, we're saying, we've been made aware of these behaviors. We need you to come into our office. We need to have a conversation. We may be going to a formal investigation, because what we want to do is we want to stop that behavior as early as possible so that it doesn't continue.
Well, one comment to answer that question.
Yes.
People select victims that are less likely to report. People have low self-esteem. They groom them. They make them feel responsible for what went on. You're the one who gave me the messages. And so part of what goes on with predation is how you select someone, and you choose someone who is less likely to come forward. That's why we said enough in some of these things, empower people to come forward, and that's part of what we're trying to do.
Wonderful. In the brochure, Title IX, for University of San Francisco, in the middle section it says, sexual misconduct includes a broad range of non-consensual behaviors focused on sex. One of the things that we have heard from other speakers, other presenters, is that it's not about sex, it's about power. And it goes back to basically grooming this person to make them feel powerless next to you, to then sexually harass them.
Right. So for our brochure here, it's focused on sex and or gender that have like an effect of threatening. So we break it down for each policy. So sexual harassment, we definitely know that's more so, it can be based off of power dynamics. So my faculty member or my professor says, hey, you need to come to office hours. If you don't come to office hours, you're not going to pass this course. We know that those power differentials there, but for based off of our federal, like the federal guidelines, it's based off of, is there discrimination based off of sex or gender? And so that's where this language specifically is taken from. But
So,
we,
I'm sorry, please.
Go ahead.
Is it different when you're talking about a faculty member who is sexually harassing or has raped a student versus student on student?
Regardless, through our process, all parties, like we have, the process starts with the report. If there's a faculty member involved with a student, that was going to go through Title IX, but also HR. If it's only students involved in the process, then it's going to go through Title IX and then student conduct. But the process as far as in support services and the resources is all going to be the same. It's just depending on which office is going to take the lead.
I know the
Let me jump in because I think there's two really important factors here. One is we know in our public schools, 90% of children with disabilities are sometimes abused because they make such bad reporters. Part of what happened with sexual harassment in colleges, which has driven all this, was the professor would say the person's 18, they're at college. And so there was a sense of, are you able to say yes when there's that much of a power differential? That's why sexual harassment is frequently defined in terms of quid pro quo. Is this going to affect your grade? What are you going to get in return? And the same thing happens in terms of the assembly. What's going to happen to your career? Are you going to be able to continue to work in politics if you say no? If you push someone away, will they be offended? And so those are the issues that bring it in terms of power. But there is gratification being sought on many different levels that are intersecting with these events. And we have to understand this. So one of the things we're focusing on, and one of the groups I work with is Community Matters that deals with bullying. And we're trying to help people make real, genuine connections. Because if you make a connection with someone at the heart, you're less likely to harm someone. The shootings we just saw in Parkland involved a young man who didn't have very good connections. You're able to make someone to an object if you're not capable of empathy. We have to work together in creating communities where there's empathy, and that has to be part of this dialogue.
The reason for my questions is that it's very different when we're talking about co-employees, sexual harassment between employees here in the Capitol, and sexual harassment from a legislator or supervisor towards an employee because of the power dynamics. And I think that I would imagine that those are dealt with differently.
Yeah, but when you see something like Survivor, you know, there are cliques that are formed, people want to get accepted. There are a lot of relationship dynamics that go on even when they're peers. That's why we're really fortunate in the state that we have affirmative consent. Well, you know, what position are you in? How do you feel about it? Are you able to say no? All those things become important, and that's part of what we try to build into Bridget, where there's support if someone feels themselves stuck in that situation, where people could talk about how do you handle this when you're in that type of situation. And it's difficult because a lot of these men who are very successful, they really have not learned interpersonal skills. They know how to speak and be in front of people, but they don't know how to ask someone whether they're interested in them. And they have both high self-value but low self-esteem underneath the surface. And they do things like expose themselves and do things because they're afraid they're going to get rejected. They have emotional problems. So we have to understand what are the pathways, what are the signs of these individuals, how can we help them connect at a level where they don't lose the sense of the person that they are harming by their conduct.
And don't forget too that when we're talking about coworkers, that even if you don't have a quid pro quo situation, you have a hostile environment situation, because there are two different kinds of sexual harassment. And they're talking about schools, but I'm talking about the workplace, which is more relevant when you're talking about the legislature here. So when you have a hostile environment situation, you may also have a pressure not to complain, because let's say we're talking about traditional, more, females not complaining about a male, but let's say you have a lot of male coworkers who are making comments about, being and very raw about their experiences, and talking about sexual experiences or making sexual language, and you have a woman who wants to fit in, and there's a lot of pressure in many cases. I mean, in law firms often, just like here, sometimes you may be not as, there may not be as many women, so you don't want to say something because you don't want to rock the boat and you want to get forward, and there are more men involved, so you may just keep your mouth shut, and that's a real common situation. I see it in almost every industry we deal with, and that's very common. I think that's more common than anything. By the way, we're starting to see more women speak up with this whole Me Too movement. I'm starting to see many more women make complaints, but there's still pressure, there's still fear, and so that's what we're dealing with.
If I may, Madam Chair, going back to the comment. You also there was talk about restorative discipline, but it just seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, when we're talking about restorative discipline, we're talking about student on student, but if it's faculty member on student, wouldn't that be different? You're not going to be as concerned about that faculty member who's using his power or her power over that student and the student's grade and the student's future as you would peer on peer, I would assume.
Okay, so what we're talking about sometimes is a slippery slope of relationships. People feel they have fallen in love with someone. And so it depends what the behavior is and what the action is. If we could stop something earlier, then there isn't something legal and someone has to be terminated or put on leave. So we're trying to bring the sort of awareness that we're preventing, and we're starting things earlier in terms of what is going awry in a relationship. We have to be really clear that when there is this type of relationship, that you can't consent due to the power differential. Like therapists can't have sex with patients. Doesn't matter what the age of the person is. We have that in a lot of other professions. We have to recognize that in a lot of jobs, that if you have a certain position, someone really can't consent, and this is inappropriate for you to get involved with them. So that, if you catch it early enough, and someone says, I think it's okay, they're an adult, they're not in my class now, that's when you could provide that opportunity for education. And that's what we're trying to do with prevention, is have people recognize that in a timely fashion before someone has crossed that boundary or line where there's no going back.
So we're talking about prevention. Once they've crossed the line, then there have to be consequences.
Yes, there has to be consequences for behavior. If there aren't consequences, it continues. And you want the consequences to be proportional. And one of the issues with hostile work environment that happens is we have tended to look at it in terms of the individual creates a hostile work environment. We are really talking about cultures. I was involved evaluating someone who used to work in the Texas legislature as a page. They used to make the women who were pages wear low-cut tops and try to see who could flip the most amount of quarters in their tops by the end of the day. I mean, that was the sort of culture that existed in the Texas legislature. We have to be aware of what's going on in terms of government and culture and what's acceptable.
Well, that's why I'm so proud of the way the committee has been put together, and the very first meeting had to do with culture and changing the culture, because that is where it begins, is changing the culture.
I'd like to also add that when you have, in your example, where you have a professor and a graduate student or a student, obviously the professor is breaking policy, stepping over the line in so many ways because of the power imbalance. There needs to be a punitive response, but there also needs to be a restorative response. And that, because otherwise you're not solving the long-term problem.
But it's a long-term problem for the faculty member, but you still have not resolved the issue for the student, because the professor, in this case, has used their power. So you're working on restorative discipline for the professor, but what happens to the victim?
There's no doubt that in that situation, the professor needs to be removed from the community, because the student can't thrive otherwise. But at the same time, just removing that professor, which we've seen over and over again, and then they go somewhere else, just as you've seen in the Catholic Church and with priests and otherwise, it doesn't solve the long-term societal problems. So prevention is the best, but we have to both have a disciplinary and a restorative, because if you do not reconnect that person to some community somewhere where they can start to behave in a normalized fashion, then you will be fighting this fight and you will be putting more young people at risk, or people at risk in general.
And there's also victim services. That didn't happen to the late 70s. I mean, it wasn't until Vincent and some other cases that rape shield laws were applied to sexual harassment, where you can argue how someone was dressed. Basically was the basis of why you could assault someone. You need to support those who come forward, because it takes a tremendous amount of courage, and we don't want to lose that in the mix. And we're very focused on supporting those to come forward and encouraging them. That's the pushback technology. They get something back. That's being able to see the numbers, that they're not alone, that we've been able to see lately.
Let's not forget that, with the exception of interns and fellows, we're not exactly like faculty and students. And we have multiple members of the legislature that are married to staffers, or who start out as co-equal staffers and somebody gets elected or somebody gets a promotion. So even though anti-nepotism or cohabitation, or what is it, what's the term? Policies are something we should discuss. It's also problematic because you also don't want to, while you don't want the creepy legislator asking out the young intern.
Yeah, correct.
Not saying any names, by the way. You also don't want people that have legitimate relationships having to hide them for fear of somebody losing their office. Right. So it's a little trickier than in the case with faculty, where I agree with you. I think there's a bright line. We don't have the luxury of that bright line with some of these issues here.
Now, Google and Facebook just put a policy in that you can ask somebody out once, and if they say no, that's it. You have a one strike and you're out policy. I thought it was really interesting.
As somebody who comes from Hollywood and was a development executive, I will have to rewrite the plot of every single romance movie that's ever made.
I know.
That
I mean,
becomes our policy.
I had a client who said that he, had he not chased his assistant around the room, he would not be married to this day. I mean, that's the old, those are the old 40s movies, right?
And in the movie Cable Guy, which is a movie about stalking, he says, "Is there any chance we'll get together? Maybe 1 in a million, then I have a chance." And then he keeps moving forward in terms of trying to create that relationship. We also know that you folks work very hard. You don't have a lot of time to meet someone else if you're single. You're often fundraising, you're meeting with constituents. Social psych research says we tend to meet the people in the circle of where we're working. And we have to take that into account with the very nature of what it means to be committed.
Assemblymember Waldron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quick, do these applications document and track progress? I know they can save details, or you can report. Do any of them give the victim any kind of update, if their thing was received, where it is in the process, or anything like that?
Well, we have an automatic, you get an automatic reply that immediately says that it's been received, and then it's at that point up to the employer. So there's it's a communication device. So it goes back and forth, and there's obviously communication between the employer and the employee. So the first response is automatic, that it's been received. After that, it's going to be between the employer and the employee to have the employer let the employee know where it is. So it's going to be dependent, obviously, on the employer to let the employee know what the response is. And, at some point, like I said, it's going to be the education of the employer to communicate. I mean, just like really any hotline that we've talked about thus far, it's going to be incumbent on training of the people in charge to make sure that they're doing their job, and that they're doing an adequate job in getting back to the employee. I mean, that part we kind of can't change, but that'll be up to me in my attorney hat role to make sure that people are doing that.
In the Callisto app, where it has the wait for others, like say they report or and they're waiting, it might be a month later. Is there some kind of a message back or something that they get that notifies them someone has reported, and then they can go ahead and report if they want.
Right. So if there is a match that occurs, so if you've wrote everything and you're waiting, once that another person writes the same information as match, you will get an email letting you know that there was a match. Then you will get an email from myself, the Title IX coordinator, because our process is streamlined. I'm the only person who has access to any of the reports that get submitted. You'll get an email from me letting you know, which you're aware that there was a match. Would you like to submit your full report, and would you like to move forward in the process? So then we'll call them in. So they do get notified there's a match, and they can still choose at that point if they want to be a part of the process. They can choose if they don't want to be a part of the process, but then that's when our communication with our office starts.
Okay. The other thing with these applications, what security or procedural drawbacks are they? I mean, it's digital. We know there's all kinds of issues with that. Security, and then legal. I mean, is everything there able to be opened up to public records request or, something? And what are the protections?
So in terms of security, we have standard military 256-bit encryption. When reports go out, they can either be seen again or not seen. We're biometrically sealed in terms of all of our data centers. We're approved, we're HIPAA, COPA, FERPA, SIPA, Patriot Act compliant. Our legal counsel was the head legal counsel for Bloomberg Media and wrote the international handbooks on privacy and libel. So we've written white papers on child nudity, on death after a report being filed and not being acted on quick enough. So we've approached all of those in terms of what's going on. We also provide, and this was because our clients asked for it, a detailed list of everyone who is invited to work on any particular report. Everything's documented and logged, time-stamped, and says what happens. So every report is its own entity, and you can only be invited in to see it by a moderator who's properly trained in the law and as well as in restorative practices.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, our information is not public. It belongs to the employer. And so we have all the privacy, the appropriate and privacy that I did not draft, our intellectual property attorneys did. So the information belongs to the employer. It's encrypted, of course, but it belongs to the employer. So obviously they can be subpoenaed, just like any employer can be subpoenaed. But it would be governed by, subpoena and deposition requests, just like anybody could be going forward. And you would have the same information, you would have the same attorney-client privilege, information or work product privileges that we all, use now as we do. But, we took those protections as good lawyers did in building this document.
Mm-hmm. And then I just have two really quick. Can you upload videos or audio recordings and put them in your reporting?
Yeah, you can for Callisto as well. You can upload videos, pictures, or audio recordings.
Okay. And I'll just leave the other one. That's fine. Thank you.
This has been a really amazing panel. It's incredible what can be done, with this internets thing. And if you don't mind just sticking around, just in case after the next panel there's further questions, it would be great to have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll bring up our last panel before we go to public comment, which is providing victim support through reporting model systems. And for that, we have Mary Wickham, County Counsel for Los Angeles County, and J.P. Sherry, General Counsel of Los Rios Community College District. Welcome, and thank you very much for your patience and sticking with us through the previous two panels. And I'll allow Ms. Wickham to begin whenever she's ready.
Hello. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for inviting me to speak this afternoon before all of you. My name is Mary Wickham. I'm the County Counsel for Los Angeles County, and I'm here to discuss the county's policy of equity, which we believe is a best practice model. The county, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the model and how it came into existence, and I believe I have handouts to kind of walk us through some of it. So back in the early 2000s, our sheriff's department was under a very difficult federal consent decree case. And one of the requirements of that case was that the department develop a sexual harassment policy. I was the lead county counsel on that case at the time, and myself and a group of subject matter experts, outside counsel, spent about 6 months developing what we now refer to as the county policy of equity. a lot of thought and deliberation went into this model. And I would submit that for any model, a lot of time and consideration must be put forth in order to make sure you get a model that works for your culture. We've been talking a lot, you've been talking today a lot about culture change. That is exactly what is at issue here. In the Sheriff's Department, which you can imagine was not an easy culture to change. 23,000 employees, 15,000 sworn officers, under a federal consent decree to do this, still resisted, and it took a couple of years before we started to see a change in that culture. But the culture did change, and today it's a culture where reporting is the norm. So that culture change was not lost on our Board of Supervisors. And it worked so well in the Sheriff's Department and brought them into compliance with the federal consent decree, which is no small task, that our board wanted it to be a county-wide model. So beginning in 2011, myself and a group of people were asked to turn it into a county-wide model, which we did. And again, we spent 6 months with a small group of people working in a war room type atmosphere, developing what is now the county policy of equity. So given the late hour, I'm just going to touch on a couple of key characteristics of the county policy of equity, which we believe make it a best model and distinguish it from other models. The first thing, the policy itself. Most harassment, discrimination, retaliation policies start with harassment, discrimination, retaliation. In the county, what we did is we added an additional standard, and that standard is inappropriate conduct towards others based on a protected class. This is a policy that addresses more than sexual harassment. It addresses all the protected classes. And I would submit if you're going through the exercise of putting in place a new mechanism, you might as well just address all the protected classes, because that's really the best practice in today's world. So this inappropriate conduct toward others standard based on a protected class, it requires much less than what is required to violate a harassment or discrimination policy. For example, the inappropriate conduct in the workplace need not be severe or pervasive or unwelcome or intentional to violate the county's policy of equity. It can just be inappropriate, but it has to be tethered to one of the protected classes. So, for example, an inappropriate joke about sexual orientation or race or sex or religion may trigger a potential violation of our policy and result in a complaint being filed, an investigation being conducted, and appropriate action, being taken. What's significant about that and what's worked so well in the county is because the standard is lower, the employer is put on notice of inappropriate conduct before it rises to the level of harassment and discrimination. So you're able to intervene early and correct it. And that results in often folks not losing their job, but instead maybe receiving counseling or a written reprimand or something like that, which is really the culture you want. You don't want, if the conduct is severe enough, of course, it may result in somebody losing their job. But what we have found is that we're able to get at the conduct much sooner. And our culture is one that supports filing complaints. I mean, we have 100,000 employees in the County of Los Angeles. On average, we receive 5,000 to 6,000 complaints a year. And that's something that I'm often asked about when I discuss our policy. Some folks are still under the impression that if you have a lot of complaints, you have a lot of problems. That's not it. If you have no complaints, you have a lot of problems. If you have 6,000 complaints, you've got a healthy workplace where people feel safe to come forward and complain. And that's the model you want to kind of move towards. Another critical issue with respect to any new policy that you roll out is that you must educate behind it. You must have a robust education arm when you introduce a new policy. Senator Mitchell, you were discussing implicit bias training. In the County of Los Angeles, our Board of Supervisors this year has mandated that all departments go through implicit bias training. And that sort of commitment to educating the workplace is required for something like this to be successful. People have to understand it's a new day. What you think is funny, a lot of people won't. and you have to educate, and you can't dismiss that concern. I mean, fair enough for folks to think, you mean I can't say that anymore? And they need to be trained. That's right, you can't say that anymore, all right? And that takes some time. Before we introduced the county policy of equity, we spent that time on the front end educating our supervisors who did receive, our supervisors and managers. They've received training different than the rest of the workforce. And the law in California requires that. Supervisors must be trained differently in what their role is, what their responsibilities are, and what the liability is for the employer if they fail to act. Because in California, if a supervisor is involved in the conduct, it's strict liability for the employer. You don't have a defense, you're liable. So they have to be educated in that. Another key distinction between about our policy is that we have a centralized intake unit. There is no barrier to filing a complaint under our policy of equity in the County of Los Angeles. You don't have to go through your supervisor. You don't have to go through your HR unit. You can go directly, and you're encouraged to go directly to our intake unit. And that's worked like a charm because, you know, people are afraid. People go to work to earn a living, get a paycheck, and go home and take care of their families, basically. If they're caught up in something or witness something, they may not want to get involved in it. And they certainly may not want to go to their boss or their HR department if that means revealing their identity and all of that. So in the county, we've eliminated that as a barrier. You go directly to the intake unit. And the intake unit, and this is another critical fact, and a requirement in my view, is staffed by subject matter experts. Many of them are employment lawyers, folks with HR background. So when the complaint comes in, and the complaints are all built on a database, you file online, you populate a script, basically. We walk the complaining parties through a script. So what comes in is a narrative of whatever the incident is. They're allowed to identify witnesses and all of that. The intake unit receives that digitally. You can also, make a phone call or come in person. But the overwhelming majority of complaints come in online. And then our subject matter experts, our intake unit, assess the complaint. Every complaint that comes in to the intake unit gets an initial investigation. And what that means is that often the complaining party is spoken to, so we hear them. We hear their story. If a witness is identified, we speak to the witness. If evidence is introduced, we look at the evidence. And the intake unit then makes an assessment whether, based on that initial complaint, there's a potential violation of the policy or not. If they determine there is, then it goes for further investigation. And the further investigation involves interviewing the subject or the involved person. And that's another critical component. You must afford due process to both sides of this equation. It's just not appropriate to hear and base a decision on one side of the story. You have to hear both sides of the story if there's something there. For those complaints where there is something there and it goes for further investigation, then ultimately that investigative report is presented to, and this is another key requirement or distinction about our process, to an outside panel of subject matter experts. So the county has retained nine what we call county equity oversight panel members. They're employment lawyers, they're HR specialists. They work pursuant to contract for the county. They're not county employees. We can terminate them at will. And they work for, basically, it's almost pro bono. They work for a fraction of their normal rate. So any completed investigation gets reviewed by this panel. And every week in the County of Los Angeles, we have CEOP hearings. And at those hearings, it's not about the complainant and the subject at that point. It's about the involved department, the investigation, and the panel. So the involved department shows up, for example, if it's a complaint against the fire department or the fire chief, that chain of command will be there. The panel will be there. We meet in panels of 3. Everyone's expected to have reviewed the investigation before that hearing so that they're knowledgeable in the facts. And what's fabulous about these hearings is that's where the dialogue and the education happens, because we have these subject matter experts explaining to, the involved department members why this conduct violated our policy. And that's an opportunity for folks to ask questions, to push back, to get clarification on both sides. But at the end, the panel then makes a recommendation to the department of what they think, if the policy's been violated, what they think the appropriate discipline should be. And that's just guided by, the severity of the conduct involved. Ultimately, it's up to the department to accept the recommendation or not. 99% of the time they do, because they recognize the resources that have been spent in coming forward or substantiating the recommendation. So that has worked very well. Another distinguishing characteristic, supervisors in the County of Los Angeles, management supervisors, they have an affirmative duty to report potential violations of the policy of equity. So if I'm a supervisor or a manager and I witness something, or if I'm put on notice of something, a potential violation of our policy, and I fail to report it, I myself will be subject to discipline for failure to report. And that has worked like a charm, because if a supervisor sees something and sweeps it under the rug, the employer is liable for that conduct. So we wanted to make our supervisors accountable and have some skin in the game, and it's worked very well. Other things that I would recommend, any best practice model must have, and ours has, is an option for mediation. We offer mediation to the complaining party or anybody who would like to go through it. It's voluntary, but it gives another opportunity for somebody to be heard and listened to and have their concerns addressed. Finally, I guess what I would conclude with are 2 points. One is, no matter how successful your model is, it will never eliminate all harassment or inappropriate conduct in the workplace. It just won't. But it will significantly mitigate it. In the County of Los Angeles, we've cut our employment litigation costs as a result of this model in half, from $30 million down to $15 million. Occasionally it spikes if we have a bad case, but it doesn't eliminate it. We still have bad cases. Sometimes people just don't come forward. But when we're put on notice of it, we're able to intervene and mitigate our damages and address the conduct. And then finally, as I've said before, but I'll say again because I believe it's so important, having implemented this model in 2 significant zones, that you must take a minute and have a group of subject matter experts come together and figure out what works best for your workplace. This isn't something you can just slap together. It's not a one-size-fits-all. A lot of what's been discussed today, and there's a lot of best practices that should be in any model, but you still need to look at your workplace and figure out what would work best. In the County of Los Angeles, our Board of Supervisors who are elected have subjected themselves to the policy of equity. So they operate under the same policy as the rest of us. And if complaints come in against them, they're subjected to the same investigation and outcome as the rest of us. And that says a lot too, because leadership at the top must support it if it's going to work at all.
Thank you. We'll move to Mr. Sherry now, and then we'll come back to both of you for questions.
Thank you very much, Senator. Good afternoon. My name is J.P. Sherry. I'm the General Counsel for the Los Rios Community College District here in Sacramento. I also coordinate our governmental relations. Los Rios Community College District is made up of the American River College, the Cosumnes River College, Folsom Lake College, and Sacramento City College. We have approximately 75,000 students, approximately 7,000 plus or minus employees. I was asked to come to you to share with you our practices for creating the confidential advocate program at each of our colleges. And you should have in front of you 3 handouts. This is one handout. I believe your staff member grabbed another one, and there's a third one here. But the 2 one-page handouts you have are on page 5 and 7 of the larger book, and I'll talk about those in a moment. I was asked to talk a little bit about why we did this and then what it is. We started this program when my board president, Pamela Haynes, many of you may know of her from her years here at the legislature, was meeting with Barbara Boxer's office. The staff member at that point in time, this is about 3 years ago, asked whether the district had a confidential advocate program. And we asked Senator Boxer for some money to fund that, and she was not willing to provide that. But it did make it very clear to us that we did need to have that kind of a program in place at our colleges, and we started the practice of getting there from here. Our first step when we returned to California was to take a very careful look at our policies and regulations to ensure that all of the regulations, both federal and state, as well as those recommendations from the Obama administration, were incorporated into our policies and regulations, and made many changes to our policies and regulations to make sure that those appropriate and required provisions were included. For example, we now have policy that says all of our folks will be appropriately trained in dealing with sexual assault, sexual harassment, and stalking. We have a carefully crafted policy on confidentiality, when we can maintain it and when we cannot. We also have a policy requiring a prevention and awareness program, and that was beefed up in light of this review. One of the things we did, like my colleagues at the University of San Francisco, is we contracted with a company called studentsuccess.org. They provide a program called Not Anymore. The Not Anymore program is an interactive online program designed to prevent sexual assault, dating and domestic violence, and stalkings. It provides true student testimonials, which are designed to foster empathy and understanding in the folks who view it, and help them understand what sexual assault, sexual violence is, and how it can be prevented, and what roles they can have in preventing it, even if they're just a bystander in the particular situation. In order to give that program some teeth, we have tasked our student government leaders, so our student president and his cabinet, our student athletes and their folks, to be the role models for this and make sure that they're showing this program as much as they can, that they're telling people that they've seen it as a group and that this is an important part of their training as students. We next worked to create a program where our students, faculty, and staff had a confidential advocate. Prior to the addition of the confidential advocate, our students, faculty, and staff had two choices for help. They could go to our police department, or they could go to our specially trained Title IX officer and ask for help. If they didn't want to go to either of those, they didn't really have a choice. Obviously, those resources have been trained to provide support and resources for our students and staff and faculty that have experienced sexual assault, but those folks did not have the ability to be 100% confidential, and that was where we went with this program. We started out with the idea that we would appoint 1 or 2 or 3 people at each of the colleges to be this confidential advocate. We quickly learned that the law would not allow us to do that, because in community colleges we do not have sexual assault crisis counselors who are employed for that purpose, and without that underpinning, the person to whom a student or a faculty member or a staff member went to would not have the privilege to refuse to talk to anybody else about the circumstances of the report. Given that, if a person who committed an act of violence against one of our folks actually did it again, and we knew about it, and we had someone without a privilege to report it, the colleges actually could be liable for the actions of that person. As a result, we decided we needed to find that person, and we went out into the community and we found Weave. Weave is Sacramento County's primary provider of crisis intervention services for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. They hire sexual assault prevention counselors, and we contracted with Weave to put someone on our college campuses 20 hours a week, 5 hours at each of the colleges. We put a Weave email in place, which is only accessible to that person. It's weave@losrios.edu. We gave them their own phone number. It's 916-568-3011. Once again, that is only accessible to the Weave Confidential Advocate on our program. The Weave Confidential Advocate's job at Los Rios is to provide 100% confidential advice. They will not tell anybody what is told to them unless the person who tells them that wants them to. They will tell them about our police services. They will tell them about our Title IX officer. They will tell them what our colleges will do in terms of helping them through the process, and describe the processes of both the criminal process and the civil process that relates to the crime that's been committed against them. Because they are a sexual assault counselor, they have that privilege to refuse to reveal any information provided to them by the survivor. Probably more important than all of that is that this person's real job is to sit with the person, whether it's at a hospital, whether it's at a hearing, whether it's when they go talk to the police, whether it's part of our disciplinary processes. They're there to support the person who has come to them for help, and that's what is most important to me about this program. Obviously, our Weave folks understand what our college processes are and what our police processes are, and they will provide that information to someone who comes to them, so we're getting that information to them confidentially, and they get to make an informed decision about what to do once that information has been reported. The only information the colleges get is very de-identified information. As you've heard before, we as colleges have an obligation to protect our communities. So if we hear about or know about situations where violence is being portrayed or sexual violence is being perpetrated on our students, faculty, or staff, we need to figure out where it's happening, how it's happening, what is happening, so that we can take proactive measures to stop it. And so we get that very generic, someone was hurt in this particular place at this particular time, possibly characteristics of the victim if it's appropriate and anonymous enough so that it will not give away the victim's identity to us if that's what they prefer, so that we can look at this and make sure our Title IX officers have the information they need to do their job to make sure that we're protecting our folks. If our weave person is at American River College and the person who needs them is at CRC, they will travel. If the person needs them after hours, that number is a 24/7 number, that email is a 24/7 number, and weave obviously has its own 24/7 number that we provide to our students. Once this program was up and running, one of the first things we did is we made sure that every piece of information that we're required to provide either under law or it's good information to a person who's suffered from sexual violence, relationship violence, or stalking, it was in one place. And so we came up with this booklet. It's 35 pages. Frankly, it's too long, and it is as comprehensive comes, but you know, when you need to get some sleep one of these days, take a read on some of these pieces. But we thought what was really more important was to give people manageable information. And so we went together and we created this infographic, which is Your Choices for Help. Basically sets forth the 3 choices that our students, faculty, and staff has the communication information, their email or their phone numbers. For our Title IX officers, for our Title IX officers, there's a URL so that they can get, because those folks change from time to time, so they can get all that information. On the back, there's phone numbers to the district attorney's office, to the police departments, all the resources that are available as much as we can provide. So that was an easy document. We will ship this to anybody and everybody who wants it. We post it as far and wide as we can on the colleges. And this is our second version of it. I have to give kudos to my public information officer because he took the first version and just made it way better and way more accessible for our students. The second piece of information we came up with was your key points at a glance document. This document provides in short, simple, plain language to someone who has just suffered from serious trauma. What do I do after this happened? Who do I report it to? What does confidentiality mean? What are the legal rights, and what will the college do? And so we tried to do that as short and simple and plain as we could in a single document. We're pretty proud of those documents. It took a lot of work from our police department, our Title IX folks, our student services folks, and our public relations folks. And as I mentioned, all 3 of those documents are available for you. With that, I would also indicate that this is our second year of having a Weave Confidential Advocate program in place. During the first year, we had reports of 2 on-campus sexual assaults that asked for services from this particular person, and we also received information about 18 off-campus assaults for which the Weave folks were being helpful to the victims of those situations. I should say survivors, excuse me. The Weave Confidential Advocate's other role in our colleges is also to help us with sexual awareness and sexual awareness prevention, and sexual assault prevention. They assisted with 42 prevention and education trainings, presentations and outreach events, and attended a ton of meetings at each of our colleges helping our folks to put our sexual assault program into place. And we have a second guide that looks very similar to this one, which is our sexual assault prevention program, in which each of the colleges are undertaking activities on a yearly basis addressing sexual assault prevention. So with that, I'd entertain any questions. Thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thank you. Those are very, very impressive documents, by the way. Very clear, easy to understand. I'm going to start it off with a question for Ms. Wickham. I'm very interested, as we're talking about reporting, but also, of course, the what happens after you report part is an integral part and something that we're going to be getting into in subsequent hearings. But you did talk about the model that LA County has with the panel of judges. They're current judges?
No, they're subject matter experts.
Okay, subject
we
matter
have some
experts.
We just added a retired judge.
Okay.
But mostly employment lawyers.
Okay, I
folks
see.
with HR background.
Okay, so let me ask you. We have
Oversight panel or the first group?
The oversight panel.
Thank you. So last hearing, I don't know if you had a chance to see it, but we had Ann Ravel, formerly of the FPPC, who was here talking about their role as oversight of elected officials in other areas, campaign finance, some types of ethics violations. And she did warn about the particular flavor of elected officials and what the political pressures that elected officials are under. And she talked about that investigating and having accountability for elected officials is a little bit different than people who are employees because of the politicized environments that we operate in. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that as this has worked. Now, you mentioned that the supervisors are under the same umbrella, which I appreciate, but it also seems to me that they've never actually been investigated by this panel. So unless I've
well, I mean, the panel reviews the investigations
right,
and then makes recommendations.
Right.
Everyone is subjected to the policy, and I'll leave it at that. But, the elected are subjected to the same, requirements as anyone else. We're mindful that, and we have outside resources that we can reach out to, depending on, who the complaint might be against, and depending on the facts. So, if it's, a significant set of facts or a significant individual the complaint is being made against, maybe we'll bring in outside counsel to do that investigation.
So let me just get to the question. Actually, just. What she brought up was that she felt that the FPPC was very well positioned to do this kind of work because they're already aware, let's say, of kind of the world in which elected officials operate. And I'm just wondering if you feel that your oversight panel, given that I'd say 99.9% of what they're dealing with are employees, that when they make that shift, do you feel that there's enough guidance for them or enough understanding of the contacts with elected officials and the governance issues that elected officials are under? We're not employees of the legislature. It's a little bit different, and kind of how that accountability would happen, which would be either through the voters or from our colleagues.
Yes.
So do you feel comfortable that when it comes to dealing with the elected officials, that the same model would work well, or do you think that there's drawbacks or things that we should consider if we kind of went down that road and try to pursue setting up a similar kind of panel to deal with the legislature?
I mean, in my experience now working under this model for, a significant number of years, our model works like a charm, whether the complaint's against an elected person or not. I mean, this is an area of subject matter expertise. This is employment law. And this is an area where the law is well defined. And, it makes it easier if the electeds just subject themselves to the policy. We didn't have to do the analysis on whether they're, an employee or not. They just put themselves into the process. But that analysis could be done. And, I mean, this is a workplace. And in today's climate, I would suggest most elected may want to subject themselves to this model. What's important is that they feel and that we deliver a fair, objective model where the investigations are thorough, well done, and that we get to, the truth and that it's fair. And, oversight is a big word. Our equity oversight panel is really just subject matter experts who come in and look at the work product and make a recommendation as to, back to the county on what the recommended discipline should be. It's not oversight in like the FPPC sense of oversight.
And in terms of what that discipline is, for an employee, discipline, can look like a suspension or training. What would it typically look like in this model for an elected official, something short of removing from office? What other types of discipline, would you envision them recommending? And if they're recommending, who in our model would they recommend to? Do you have any thoughts? How does that work at the county?
And in the model for an elected, depending on, the severity and the frequency and all of that. But if it's a first time, somewhat innocent in the scheme of things, then the recommended discipline could be counseling, it could be mediation. And we're mindful of the need to keep things confidential. We view it as a personnel matter and that they're entitled to confidentiality. And we go through great lengths to give them that and protect them. And it's, at the department head level, at elected level. So that's how we've handled it. And it's rare that it is at that level, but it may be at that level, and we've handled it, I believe, well at that level.
And then who are the recommendations being made to? The rest of the supervisors?
We have a schematic, so it just depends on who's involved, and it may, depending on that, it may go to the chair, it may go to the CEO to deliver. I mean, we've worked it out. But again, thought was given to that point on who delivers that message. I mean, you have to stare at some org charts, and you have to think about how is this going to work for people to have the trust in turning themselves and subjecting themselves to this model. And it's fair for folks to demand that, and that we have to deliver that. That's fair.
Okay. Senator Mitchell.
Thank you. First of all, Ms. Wickham, thank you for coming from sunny Southern California up to, I don't know where we are, what that is outside, up to wherever we are. Is it Oz? I think we're in Oz. Thank you for that. First of all, Senator Morlock asked for a copy of your policy. I understand staff has it, but I just wanted to state for the record that he made that request. So I appreciate a couple things on your chart. I appreciate the case classifications, the ABCN, but I was kind of tickled because this almost looks like our how a bill becomes a law chart. And what people always ask is, how long does this take? And then you go well, I saw Willie Brown go through this whole process in half a day once, 30 years ago, or it's the 2-year process. So my question is, and I know it's not really a fair question because it depends on if it's an A, B, C, or N, but we are, there's impatience around what we're dealing with as a legislature right now, and I get that. And there's also danger in artificially rushing a process. And so based on that, I'm wondering if you could give me a guesstimate, since you've got kind of two between your intake specialist unit and the oversight panel, looking at all of your circles, how long it could take. Generally, just to give us a frame of reference.
So the complaints come in real time, and what we do at the intake unit is we have identified, a few folks every day who work the hotline kind of. So they're reviewing in real time on our database the complaints as they come in, and they flag the ones that are more significant than other ones. I mean, a lot that comes in, we know from the beginning it's just not jurisdictional or not really going to warrant much further investigation. But the ones that we flag early on, and then we expedite them through the process. Now, we have 100,000 employees in the County of Los Angeles, and we're a government. So, if depending on the severity, I mean, of course, if it's significant, and depending on who's involved, we will expedite those and get them through the entire process and back in as quick a period of time as we need. If it's a more run-of-the-mill kind of situation that, was a policy violation, but maybe coworker on coworker, we intervene and maybe separate the individuals immediately. We take that action immediately. But as far as the investigation going the full distance, coming back to the panel, it could be 8 months.
So you triage.
We triage.
Plain and simple. You triage. Okay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's it. But the significant ones get pulled out and expedited through.
And so how do employees know? We heard in the technology panel how important it is, and through some of the apps, that employees get the automatic response. Like your claim has been received, because that's what we've heard a lot here in the legislature, that people don't know if any action is taken, and there's just this black hole of information. And so if you're triaging, how do I know that action is being taken? What evidence or how do I know?
Sure. So again, this is all based on a database, and we've built into that database all of the necessary form letters, notification letters, We're in like generation 3 now of this database. So, you know, it's in a good place. And our intake workers, you know, can push buttons and letters get generated, information gets back to the complaining party, to the involved person who ultimately may become the subject. So we take that very seriously because people need to know what's going on. Both sides of the equation need to know. And we've built that into our system. And, you know, folks call us, so we communicate that way. But also we just have a lot of standard forms that get triggered automatically through the database so that to keep people in the loop.
So how long, you know, county workers, state employees, same thing. How long do you think it really took for your employees to buy into the system, and how was it apparent to you that culture shift had begun to happen?
So I'll talk about the Sheriff's Department. It took 3 to 5 years for the Sheriff's Department to buy in. And the day I knew it changed was the day when one of the fiercest opponents called me and was about to file a complaint, and was not about himself, but about somebody else, and was so happy that there was a process in place that they could just refer things to. And that's what we've learned through this process. While initially there was resistance at the county level too, department heads thought we should be exempted. We shouldn't be part of this process. It shouldn't apply to us. We're different. And we went through that training explaining you're not different. You're not different under the law. But ultimately, they get on board. But at the Sheriff's Department, the day that chief called and told me he was happy there was a process, he was following the process, I knew things had changed. And then a colleague of mine who had been involved in building this process in the county of Los Angeles was on an airplane one day, and a female deputy sheriff sat next to her. She didn't know who she was. And the female deputy sheriff was going on and on about how happy she was to work in a culture where reporting was the norm, where you were encouraged to report. And my colleague friend was just elated because we had been there when that wasn't the culture. So I would say 3 to 5 years before you see buy-in. Not to suggest that it doesn't work for 3 to 5 years, but before folks kind of simmer down and it's just routine. In the county of Los Angeles, the norm is to file a complaint. That's the norm.
And for that time frame to be reflected in a male-dominated, hierarchical entity like a law enforcement division is impressive. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I just want to clarify one thing. When you said 8 months to go through the process, is that including sort of a wait time because you have a backlog of these, or is that do you start day one investigating and then it takes 8 months to go through the process?
No, we have a backlog. I mean,
So assuming you start day one, how long would the process I know every case is a little different, but let's say you're kind of on a scale
8 weeks.
of 8. Oh, okay. Okay, that's
I mean,
a very different story.
It's not an elaborate, it's not rocket science. It really isn't. It's been up and running for many years, most places. It's just building a model that works and implementing it and then running it with subject matter expertise. You need to have subject matter expertise. You can't turn it over to just anybody to do.
This isn't a citizens commission.
No.
Okay.
It is not.
That was the other piece. Following your questions on FPPC, while they have the relationship in terms of oversight over electeds, they're not subject matter experts. That's the difference.
Yes.
That I heard loud and clear.
Absolutely. Anyone from this end of the dais? Assemblymember Reyes.
Thank you. How many people do you have on staff that take care of this part for the LA County?
The intake unit employs about 20. My recollection is 20. I'm not over it anymore. I'm doing the county council work now, but about 20. And then county DHR, who does the further investigation, they have about another 20 investigators. The panel, the oversight panel, we have 9 members. They convene in groups of 3. Money, it takes money to operate this model, but you save money on the back end. I mean, and you change the culture in the process.
That's key.
How
many employees did you say you have?
So I'd say about 20 work the intake unit,
No, I'm sorry. How many employees?
Oh,
for the county?
100,000.
100,000, okay. And Dos Rios?
Yes, Assembly Member. I would just point out that in our process, we have individual people at each of the colleges. There's one equity officer at each college, plus 3 folks in our HR department that are specially trained. When we get beyond that level, we hire outside folks to help us. And so typical investigations take 90 days or less in our organization. And I'm sorry, the first part of your question was how? Yeah.
How many employees total do you have?
Well, none of them does this full time. So there's about 12 folks internally that handle this on a part-time basis. They have other jobs at the community colleges. You know, we wear many, many hats as we do our work.
And how many employees total do you have
about 7,000 plus or minus. Plus, remember, we have about 75,000 students, and our program does encompass both student complaints as well as faculty and staff administration complaints.
Wonderful. And then I'd like to go back to the weave.
Yes, ma'am.
First, I want to thank you both. This was a very robust conversation. It brings it back to something that is closer to what it is we do. Having your supervisors, so you have the elected officials as well as employees and supervisors. Are your board of trustees also included in this?
Yes, ma'am. They're locally elected. Now, I would tell you if someone made a complaint about one of our trustees or our chancellor or one of our executive staff, we would go immediately to outside counsel. That would not be handled by internal folks. The power dynamic is just too large for that to happen. And I believe in our situation, we would be reporting back to the full board, which is a little bit different than your legislature of 120 folks. I don't see how that works for you, but that's what we would be doing.
We don't know yet either. Weave. I want to go back to Weave because that has been implemented here as well, and I know the questions have been asked. So I want to be clear in my mind. When you hire a sexual assault counselor, that person is not a mandatory reporter then?
The word mandatory reporter is loaded in that context. If it's a person who is a minor, we are all mandatory reporters. So there is no confidentiality if you came and said you were assaulted as a minor, or if your minor child came and said I was assaulted. So let's just put that in the parking lot for a moment. Everyone else that would come to our Weave confidential reporter, there is no reporting that they make at all. It's 100%. It's essentially a patient and counselor privilege between the two of them. And if the patient says, I'd like you to share this information, or you're authorized to share this information, then the counselor may. If the patient says no, then as I read the law, that counselor has the privilege and is required to maintain the privilege of the person who brings the report.
You say that you receive de-identified information.
Yes, ma'am.
Does this provide enough information to then, if you receive information that there was a rape, a criminal act, is that then turned over to the police so they do their own investigation?
The information that we would have in that particular circumstances would not be enough to turn anything over to the police. The police would be advised of that because as colleges, we also have our Clery obligations to report criminal actions that happen on our campus. And that's one reason we ask for the de-identified data, to make sure we're fulfilling that federal obligation. The other reason is to make sure we're identifying patterns or patterns of people who are being victimized, patterns of places where victimization is occurring, patterns where we can do something as a college to say we're going to stop whatever's happening over in that spot. That's the kind of information that we might get from someone on a de-identified basis, but there would be no way for our police officers, given the de-identified report, to do anything beyond that.
Then my final question is, most of this has to do with sexual assault as opposed to sexual harassment. Is sexual harassment handled differently?
I believe that if someone were sexually harassed and they wanted to access our Weave person, they would have that ability to do that, and it would be handled the same way. Typically, they don't ask for an advocate in that context, and so our normal processes of investigation and discipline apply to sexual harassment complaints.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? With that, thank you. I want to thank the panel very, very much. This was really, really helpful. And with that, I'm going to move to public comment. So I'm going to ask any member of the public who would like to comment to please come up to the microphone. Anybody? here to comment? Okay, seeing none, I do want to announce that next Tuesday we're having our next hearing, and we're going to be joined with someone who I think will be fascinating for all of us, and that's retired California Supreme Court Justice Carlos Moreno, who's going to be continuing to delve into the issues around accountability and due process. With that, this hearing is adjourned.